Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back in time, not with cannon fire and swashbuckling sword fights, but with something quieter. Before the black flags, before buried treasure, and long before Johnny Depp turned piracy into a fashion statement, there was a world of calm, endless seas, and busy, ambitious empires. So let's settle in, get comfortable, dim the lights, and picture, if you will, a vast ocean stretching out into the dark. The year is somewhere in the early 1600s, give or take a decade, and the world is about to get complicated. But for now, the waters are still, almost deceptively still. The age we're stepping into tonight wasn't yet the so-called Golden Age of Piracy. In fact, it wasn't even close. At this time, the seas were dominated not by outlaws, but by rules. And by rules, I mean large, overly bureaucratic empires with flags, laws, and an inflated sense of their own importance. Because naturally, someone had to be in charge of all this water. At this point in history, the major players were clear. Spain and Portugal were at the top of the heap, clinking goblets over the sheer scale of their overseas empires. England, France, and the Netherlands were hovering just behind, glaring at Spain the way a group of slightly underfunded rival startups might glare at Apple. Meanwhile, far beyond Europe, other powers like the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire in India, and the Ming Dynasty in China were thriving. These civilizations didn't care much for the strange, bearded men who kept arriving in awkward wooden ships, bringing trade and trouble. It was a world connected by commerce in a way it had never been before. Gold and silver crossed oceans. Silk and spices traveled halfway around the globe. And humans, tragically, were also part of the cargo, enslaved and shipped like any other commodity. For a brief moment, it might have seemed as if the future was bright and full of endless opportunity. Well, bright for the people at the very top. For everyone else, especially sailors, it was less a story of prosperity and more a tale of barely surviving on rotting biscuits, while a man in a feathered hat yelled at you in 6 different languages. Now, let's pause and look at the trade network itself. Imagine a massive, interconnected web stretching across the globe. At its center sat Spain and Portugal, smugly counting their coins. Spain's treasure fleets were legendary, vast convoys of ships carrying unimaginable amounts of silver and gold from the Americas back to Europe. The mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia produced so much silver that it literally fueled entire global economies. Meanwhile, Portugal controlled vital trade routes to Asia, scooping up spices and silks with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for Black Friday sales. But wealth on this scale always creates tension. And like any good historical drama, tension inevitably turns into chaos. England, France, and the Netherlands looked at Spain's treasure ships and thought, what if we just took them? It wasn't piracy, not officially. It was privateering, a polite term for state-sponsored piracy, complete with paperwork. If you've ever had to fill out a government form for something mildly exciting, you can probably imagine how thrilling that must have been. Yes, sir. We'd like to attack a foreign ship. Here's our official permission slip signed by the Crown. This early form of legalized piracy set the stage for what was to come, because once you start paying people to steal, they tend to get very good at it and much less interested in stopping when the paycheck ends. From a distance, the seas might have looked peaceful. Merchant ships moved steadily back and forth, carrying goods and gold. Empires signed treaties, drew maps, and congratulated themselves on their cleverness. But beneath that calm surface, trouble was brewing. The sheer size of these overseas territories made them nearly impossible to control. A governor sitting in a fancy chair in Madrid might issue a law on Tuesday, and by the time it reached the Caribbean, it was Thursday, 6 months later, and no one cared anymore. Corruption was everywhere. Local officials often turned a blind eye to smuggling or took part in it directly. After all, a little side profit never hurt anyone, except, of course, the empire itself, which would eventually crumble. Meanwhile, the men actually sailing these ships lived in conditions so miserable that it's a miracle any of them stayed loyal at all. Harsh discipline, low pay, and constant danger meant that every voyage was one bad day away from mutiny. We'll talk more about just how grim that life was in part 2, but for now, just imagine spending months at sea in a damp, creaking wooden box, surrounded by angry strangers and questionable food. It wasn't exactly a glamorous lifestyle, and yet, these were the very men trusted to protect the lifeblood of empires, their wealth, their colonies, and their pride. So naturally, things went wrong. Think of this moment in history like a giant powder keg. Spain and Portugal had gathered enormous wealth. Other nations were jealous and increasingly bold about stealing it. Sailors were miserable and desperate. Local colonial governors were often more concerned with lining their own pockets than enforcing distant laws. It didn't take much for sparks to fly. A war here, a rebellion there, a slightly too tempting treasure ship sailing just a little too close to a group of underpaid sailors. What emerged was a kind of lawless frontier on the sea, the perfect breeding ground for piracy. At first, it wasn't romantic or dramatic. There were no iconic black flags yet, no legendary pirate captains with elaborate nicknames, just angry men in small ships, trying to survive by taking what they needed. But like any trend, it caught on. Over time, those scattered acts of theft began to merge into something larger, more organized, and far more feared. And so, we find ourselves standing at the edge of transformation. The seas are still mostly controlled by empires, but their grip is slipping. Ships heavy with gold and silver crisscross the oceans like floating invitations to theft. And thousands of desperate sailors are beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, loyalty isn't worth the trouble. In the next part, we'll step aboard one of those imperial ships and take a closer look at what life was really like for the men trapped there. Spoiler alert, it was terrible. Rotting food, brutal punishments, and endless boredom combined to create the perfect recipe for rebellion. Because before a man ever hoisted the black flag, he probably spent a long time just wishing for a way out. For now, let's let the sun set on this deceptively calm ocean. The waves are gentle, the sails are full, and the treasure is still flowing. but not for long. The ocean, when viewed from the shore, seems peaceful. Waves rise and fall with a rhythmic calm, and from a distance, a ship gliding across the horizon can look almost graceful. But step aboard one of those ships in the early 1600s, and you would quickly realize that the romance ends the moment your boots touch the deck. The men who sailed for the great empires were not living grand adventures. They were trapped inside what was essentially a floating prison. It never stopped moving, never stopped creaking, and never offered a moment of real rest. These sailors were not treated as skilled professionals, though many were highly experienced. They were seen as expendable labor, necessary to keep the empire's trade alive, but ultimately disposable. Life at sea was dangerous, filthy, and exhausting, and the pay was so low it barely seemed worth the effort. Even that meager pay was unreliable, often arriving months late or not at all. When wages did come, they were handed out with deductions for food, lodging, and equipment, leaving a sailor with barely enough to buy a single round of drinks once he finally reached shore. It's no wonder so many sailors eventually looked at pirate crews and thought, well, at least they split their plunder evenly. For many men, becoming a sailor wasn't a choice they made willingly. Some joined simply because they had no other options. If you were poor, landless, or desperate, a ship might seem like the only way to earn steady work. Others were forced into service, especially by the British Navy. Press gangs, groups of men tasked with recruitment, roamed docks and taverns, seizing anyone who looked fit enough to work. One heavy hand on your shoulder, a quick shove into a waiting boat, and suddenly you were part of His Majesty's Navy, whether you wanted to be or not. Naturally, this didn't lead to a happy or loyal crew. Many sailors began their journeys already resentful, and that simmering anger meant mutiny was always a possibility, waiting for the right spark to ignite it. Then there was the food, if you could call it that. The staple of a sailor's diet was hardtack, a rock-hard biscuit, so tough it could break teeth. To make it remotely edible, sailors had to soak it in water or beer first, and if they were lucky, it only contained a few weevils. The main source of protein was salted meat, usually beef or pork, boiled, packed in salt, and stored for months. By the time it reached a sailor's plate, it was often gray, slimy, and smelled like despair. Fresh fruits and vegetables were almost unheard of, which meant scurvy was rampant. This disease, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was as common as it was horrifying. It began with fatigue and sore gums, then progressed to bruising, reopened wounds, loose teeth, and eventually a body literally rotting from the inside out. Imagine watching your crewmates slowly fall apart, knowing there was no cure and no escape. Meals were washed down with stale water that had been sitting in barrels for weeks, often coated with algae and filled with floating debris. Sometimes beer or rum was available, which, truthfully, was probably the only thing that kept sailors sane. Sleeping arrangements weren't much better. There were no cozy bunks or private cabins for ordinary sailors. Instead, they slept in hammocks slung between beams, swinging with the motion of the ship, sometimes gently, sometimes violently. Privacy didn't exist, Space barely existed either. Ships were crammed with men, supplies, and cargo, leaving just enough room to move without colliding with someone or something. Everything was constantly damp: clothes, sails, ropes, and bedding. The ship smelled of mildew, sweat, sickness, and salt. Rats thrived in this environment, happily chewing on rope, hardtack, and occasionally human toes. Fleas and lice were unavoidable, making true cleanliness impossible. The work itself was relentless and backbreaking. Sails had to be adjusted constantly to match the changing winds, ropes hauled, tied, and untangled in an endless cycle. During storms, the danger multiplied. Every man was expected to battle the wind and waves, clinging to ropes while icy water crashed over the deck. Sailors worked on a rotating watch system, which meant there was no such thing as a full night's sleep, only a few hours of rest snatched here and there between grueling tasks. Exhaustion was constant, and the risk of death was everywhere. A single mistake could send a man overboard, disappearing into the dark sea before anyone even noticed. Stopping the ship to save him was rarely an option, so most of the time, the ocean simply claimed another life, and the rest of the crew kept working. As if the conditions weren't bad enough, discipline aboard these ships was brutal and unforgiving. Captains ruled with near absolute authority, and punishments were designed to inspire fear. The most common was flogging, a sailor tied to the mast and whipped with a cat o' nine tails, a whip with multiple knotted cords that could tear skin and muscle. Punishments were public, meant to humiliate as well as injure. For serious offenses, there were even crueler methods. Keel hauling involved dragging a man under the ship's hull, his body scraping against barnacles until he emerged shredded and often dead. Thieves might be branded or have their ears cut off. Mutineers were almost always hanged. These punishments weren't just about enforcing rules. They were about maintaining absolute control. But fear has limits, and when combined with hunger, exhaustion, and unpaid wages, it often had the opposite effect, pushing sailors closer to rebellion. Beyond the physical suffering, there was also the emotional toll. Sailors spent months, sometimes years, away from home with no way to communicate with loved ones. The ocean became an endless, isolating void, cutting them off from everything familiar. Boredom was another constant enemy. When work slowed, there was nothing to do but sit and stew in resentment. Games like dice or cards offered brief distractions, but often led to fights, especially when cheating, which was inevitable, occurred. In the evenings, sailors tried to keep their spirits up with songs, stories, and crude jokes, but it was only a thin barrier against the crushing awareness that life was cheap and death was always close. All of these factors combined, low pay, terrible food, exhausting work, harsh punishments, and a sense of entrapment, created the perfect conditions for rebellion. Many sailors didn't even realize they were primed for mutiny until the opportunity arose, when a pirate crew appeared, offering shared plunder and a say in how things were run. Piracy could start to look like freedom. Life aboard a pirate ship was still dangerous and filthy, but at least it was on their terms. But we're not quite there yet. For now, imagine being trapped aboard one of these imperial vessels, staring out at the endless horizon, longing for escape. The waves keep rolling, the sails keep creaking, and somewhere deep down, you begin to wonder, what if there's another way to live? As we move into part 3, we'll step back and look at the larger forces shaping this world, the wars, the colonies, and the political chaos that created the perfect storm for piracy to rise. Because no rebellion, not even one on the high seas, happens in isolation. The stage is set, the sailors are restless, and soon the storm will break. The ocean is vast, and yet, by the early 1600s, it was becoming surprisingly crowded. Not crowded in the way a bustling city street might be, with jostling elbows and shouted greetings, but crowded with ships, thousands of them, crisscrossing the globe like a tangled web of floating ambitions. In the last part, we saw the misery of life aboard these ships, where sailors lived like overworked ants under the constant threat of punishment. But misery alone doesn't create piracy. For piracy to flourish, you need something bigger, something that shakes the established order and leaves space for chaos to slip in. And in this period, chaos was practically being manufactured on an industrial scale. The empires of Europe were not quietly sharing the seas and politely dividing resources. No, they were competing fiercely and often violently over who would control the future. And naturally, they dragged everyone else into their quarrels. The rise of colonies. Let's start with the colonies. The discovery of the Americas, or, to be more accurate, the European realization that the Americas were full of resources they could take, completely changed the game. Spain and Portugal were the early leaders, carving up enormous swaths of land and claiming them in the name of their monarchs. Spain, in particular, struck gold and silver and just about every other shiny thing they could dig out of the ground. Their ships began carrying staggering amounts of wealth back across the Atlantic. So much wealth, in fact, that it warped the global economy. Imagine being a rival nation like England or France, watching Spain grow richer by the day. It must have been infuriating. Spain wasn't just getting wealthy, it was turning into a kind of superpower. And no one likes feeling like the poor neighbor peering over the fence at someone else's gold-plated garden. The problem was, these rival nations couldn't always challenge Spain directly. Declaring war outright was expensive and risky, and kings were very sensitive about their budgets. So instead, they found a cheaper, sneakier solution: privateering. Privateering. Piracy with paperwork. Privateering was essentially state-sponsored piracy, theft, but with a government stamp of approval. A privateer was given a document called a letter of marque, which basically said, you may attack enemy ships, but only the enemy ships we tell you to. It was piracy dressed up as patriotism. For the men involved, this was a dream come true. They got to plunder treasure-laden Spanish galleons without worrying too much about legal consequences. They even got to keep a share of the loot, with the rest going back to their government. The beauty of privateering was that it gave countries like England plausible deniability. If Spain complained about one of their ships being robbed, England could shrug and say, oh dear, How terrible must have been those rogue privateers again. Nothing to do with us. This worked well until it didn't. Because once you start encouraging men to make their living by attacking ships, it's rather difficult to convince them to stop later. Many privateers, when their official contracts expired, simply kept doing what they'd been doing all along, but now, without any pesky rules to follow. They had ships, they had weapons, and they had a taste for easy gold. Why go back to obeying a king when you could answer only to yourself? And thus, the line between privateer and pirate blurred, then disappeared entirely. Wars that never seemed to end, the 1600s and early 1700s, were an exhausting time to be alive, especially if you were a sailor. Europe seemed to be constantly at war, often over issues that made very little sense to the men actually fighting. There were wars over religion, wars over territory, wars over trade routes, and occasionally wars over who got to sit on which throne. The details didn't matter much to the common sailor. All he knew was that yet again, his ship was being sent into danger because some distant king or queen was annoyed with another distant king or queen. Each war disrupted trade routes and left countless ships vulnerable. When peace treaties were finally signed, thousands of sailors were suddenly out of work, and these were men who had spent their entire lives at sea. They weren't going to settle down quietly and become farmers. They were going to keep doing what they knew best: sailing, fighting, and, when necessary, stealing. Think of it like this. Imagine a modern soldier being told, "The war's over. Good luck finding a desk job. Now replace the desk with a leaky wooden ship and the job market with open ocean." Piracy starts to seem like a pretty logical career move. Colonial weakness and corruption. As European empires expanded, their colonies became sprawling, complex networks of ports, governors, and trade posts. From the perspective of the crown back home, these colonies were neatly organized and entirely under control. In reality, they were a mess. Communication was painfully slow. A message sent from London to Jamaica might take months to arrive, by which time the situation on the ground had completely changed. Local officials often had more power than the kings they technically served, and many of those officials were, shall we say, flexible about the law. Smuggling was rampant. Merchants routinely skirted official trade rules, paying bribes to ensure that certain shipments disappeared or certain taxes weren't collected. And if a pirate crew happened to show up with goods to sell, well, gold is gold, no matter where it came from. This created an environment where pirates could not only survive, but thrive. They could sell their stolen goods in colonial markets, often to the very officials who were supposed to be hunting them. Some governors even struck quiet deals with pirates, providing safe harbor in exchange for a cut of the profits. To the average sailor, this must have felt surreal. One day, you were an outlaw, hunted by the empire. The next day, you were being welcomed into port like an honored guest, as long as you shared your loot. It's hard to take the law seriously when the people enforcing it are on your payroll. A world of opportunity for the desperate. By the late 1600s, the conditions were perfect. Trade routes were booming, carrying unimaginable wealth across oceans. Colonies were scattered and poorly defended. Wars had created a surplus of skilled but unemployed sailors, and corruption had eaten away at the very governments meant to keep order. For the men at the bottom of the social ladder, piracy wasn't just tempting, it was almost inevitable. Why risk your life for a distant king who paid you in scraps when you could risk your life for yourself and at least keep a fair share of the profit? This is why piracy didn't appear as a random burst of chaos. It was the natural result of decades of tension, greed, and neglect. The empire's rules had stretched too thin, and in the gaps, a new kind of society began to take shape, one built on rebellion, equality, and, of course, theft. The calm before the storm ends. As part 3 comes to a close, picture the world we've built so far. Massive empires straining to control vast colonies. Ships heavy with gold, silver, and spices, moving slowly across oceans. Sailors simmering with anger and frustration. And coastal towns where governors looked the other way as long as the bribes kept coming. The calm seas we saw in part 1 are now full of tension. Storm clouds are gathering. All it will take is a single spark, a ship hijacked here, a mutiny there, to ignite a wildfire of rebellion. In part 4, we'll step inside the minds of the men who made that choice. We'll explore what pushed ordinary sailors over the edge, turning them from servants of the empire into enemies of it. The decision to turn pirate wasn't always dramatic or sudden. Sometimes it was as simple as a single question: why stay loyal to a system that never cared if you lived or died? For now, let the ocean roll gently beneath us. The storm is almost here. In the last part, we explored the bigger picture: wars, colonies, and corrupt empires, all tangled together like a badly knotted rope. We saw how massive forces, far beyond any single sailor's control, created the perfect conditions for piracy to emerge. But for the men actually living it, piracy didn't appear as a grand historical event. It appeared as a choice, a deeply personal, often desperate choice, made in the dim light of a cramped ship's hold or whispered over a shared mug of sour beer. The moment when a sailor decided to abandon his old life and raise the black flag wasn't usually dramatic. It wasn't a heroic speech or a sudden act of defiance. More often, it was a quiet realization: this system will never care about me. But maybe, just maybe, I can carve out a life for myself outside of it. The final straw. Every sailor's path to piracy was unique, but most of them shared the same building blocks: misery, anger, and betrayal. We've already seen the first two: miserable food, endless work, brutal punishments, and the constant risk of death. Those were the background noise of life at sea. But betrayal was the spark. A sailor might endure terrible conditions as long as he believed there was some reward waiting at the end. But when that reward vanished, so did his loyalty. Imagine this. You've spent a year sailing through storms, battling enemy ships, watching friends die of scurvy or slip silently overboard. You finally return to port ready to collect your pay, only to be told there isn't any, or that unexpected deductions have left you with barely enough money to buy a meal. And sometimes it was even worse. Sailors were occasionally cheated out of their wages entirely, with no recourse. The captain would simply shrug, knowing that the law would always side with him. For a man who had risked everything, this was more than just unfair. It was infuriating. That moment, standing on the docks with empty pockets, was often the beginning of a very different kind of career. The temptation of choice, of course. Piracy wasn't always about revenge. Sometimes it was about opportunity, and that opportunity usually came sailing right up to you, waving a black flag. When a pirate ship captured a merchant vessel, the pirates didn't automatically kill or enslave the crew. Instead, they often gave the sailors a choice: join us or go back to the life you had before. On the surface, this seems like a simple decision. Stay honorable, keep your head down, and return to the empire's rules. But when you think about what honorable really meant, back-breaking labor, constant hunger, brutal captains, and no pay, the pirate life started to look surprisingly appealing. Pirates offered something that no navy or merchant fleet ever did: equality. On a pirate ship, there were no noble-born officers barking orders from a place of privilege. The crew voted on decisions. Plunder was divided fairly. Even the captain could be replaced if the crew decided he wasn't doing his job. For a man used to being treated as expendable, this was revolutionary. Sure, it was dangerous, but at least you were risking your life on your own terms and for your own profit. Recruitment by force or persuasion, of course. Not every sailor needed to be persuaded. Some were encouraged in a more forceful way. Pirates were always looking to strengthen their crews. If they captured a ship and found skilled sailors aboard, they might invite them to join. And by invite, I mean they gave them a choice between joining or dying. But here's the interesting part. Even under that threat, many men chose piracy willingly, because even with a sword at their throat, they could see the truth. The empire had offered them nothing but misery. The pirates, at least, were honest about what they were offering. Danger, yes, but also freedom and a fair share of the loot. In a strange way, it was the more honest deal. Famous examples of the turning point. History is full of stories about these moments of transformation. Take Black Bart Roberts, who we'll meet properly in part 15. Roberts didn't set out to be a pirate. He was forced into it when pirates captured his ship. But within weeks, he realized he preferred this new life and rose to become one of the most successful pirate captains in history. Or consider Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Before he became a legend, he was an ordinary sailor working for meager pay on merchant ships. Somewhere along the way, he saw a chance to seize power and respect that his old life could never give him. He didn't just take the opportunity, he reinvented himself completely. These stories remind us that piracy wasn't just about crime. It was about transformation. Men who had been nobody's became feared names, etched into history, simply because they decided to reject the roles they'd been given. The role of alcohol and shore leave. And, of course, sometimes the decision to turn pirate wasn't made entirely sober. Sailors spent months at sea with little to look forward to, but the occasional stop at a port. When they finally reached land, they often went a little wild, drinking, gambling, and spending whatever small wages they'd managed to keep. It was during these chaotic nights that many pirate crews did their most effective recruiting. A few too many mugs of rum, some persuasive talk about freedom and wealth, and suddenly a man might wake up aboard a pirate ship, nursing both a hangover and a brand new career. Whether he regretted it later, well, that depended on how well the next raid went. The gradual slide into piracy for most men, though, the transition wasn't instant. They didn't one day declare, "I am now a pirate," and sail off into the sunset. It was more like a slow erosion of loyalty. First, they smuggled a little on the side, maybe hiding a few goods from the captain's inventory. Then, they turned a blind eye when their ship did something technically illegal. Eventually, they found themselves sailing under a black flag, almost without realizing how they'd gotten there. This slow slide made piracy feel less like a betrayal and more like the natural next step. After all, they hadn't changed. The world around them had. The point of no return. But once a man crossed that line, there was no going back. Pirates were considered enemies of every empire. Captured pirates were hanged, often in very public and very gruesome ways. That meant joining a pirate crew was an all or nothing gamble. You couldn't dabble in piracy and then quietly return to respectable life. The moment you chose that path, you were marked forever. This is what made the decision so dramatic, even if it didn't feel that way at the time. It wasn't just about survival or profit. It was about rejecting the entire system you'd been born into and accepting that the system would never forgive you for it. The tension builds. By now, we can see how the personal and the political were intertwined. Wars and empires set the stage in part 3, but here, in part 4, we've zoomed in to see the human cost, individual sailors reaching their breaking point. Each choice added to the growing wave of piracy. One man leaving his post might seem small, but multiplied by hundreds, it became a force that no empire could ignore. And soon, those scattered deserters would gather into crews, form their own rules, and begin to challenge the very powers that had created them. In part 5, we'll follow a new recruit through his first terrifying days aboard a pirate ship, because joining is one thing, surviving is something else entirely. For now, picture a quiet moment before dawn. A ship rocks gently on the tide. Below deck, a sailor lies awake, staring into the dark, knowing that tomorrow he will leave his old life behind and step into a world of danger, freedom, and no return. In part 4, we drifted through the inner world of the sailor making that fateful choice, the moment when a man decided to abandon the rigid hierarchies of the empire and throw in his lot with the pirates. It was a decision that promised freedom, wealth, and perhaps even equality. But like so many promises at sea, it came with fine print, and very few men truly understood what they were agreeing to until they stepped aboard their first pirate ship. Tonight, we're going to follow one of those men, not a specific historical figure, but a composite of countless anonymous recruits whose stories were lost to time. Through him, we'll explore those confusing, frightening first days when the dream of piracy collided with the reality of life at sea. The first glimpse of the ship. Imagine standing on a creaking dock, the early morning mist curling around the ropes and barrels scattered at your feet. Out in the harbor, a ship waits. From a distance, it might even look majestic. Tall masts, fluttering sails, the promise of adventure stretching out toward the horizon. But as you get closer, the romantic image starts to crumble. The sails aren't pure white. They're ragged, patched with mismatched fabric. The wood is scarred from battle, smelling of tar, salt, and old sweat. And the men who crew this vessel, they're not heroic figures from ballads. They're scarred, sunburned, and missing more teeth than they have left. This is the reality of your new life. And before you've even set foot aboard, you might already be wondering if you've made a terrible mistake. The overwhelming noise and smell. The first shock comes not from sight, but from smell. A pirate ship does not smell like fresh ocean breezes and citrus groves. It smells like unwashed bodies, spoiled food, wet canvas, and gunpowder. And it hits you like a wave the moment you step aboard. Then comes the noise. Pirate ships were cramped, chaotic places where everyone was always shouting over the wind and the creaking timbers. Orders were barked in a jumble of accents: English, French, Dutch, Spanish, and sometimes languages you didn't even recognize. For a new recruit, it was overwhelming. You didn't know who to listen to or where to go. And the pirates weren't exactly known for their gentle introductions. More likely than not, your first day began with someone shoving a rope or bucket into your hands and snarling something like, "Get to work," or "Get tossed overboard." Learning the ropes. Literally, the phrase, learning the ropes, comes directly from life at sea. Ships had an almost absurd number of ropes, each with its own specific function. Pull the wrong one at the wrong time, and you might accidentally drop a sail, snap a mast, or get yourself tangled and dragged overboard. Experienced sailors could tell at a glance what needed to be done. But for a newcomer, it was like stepping into a foreign world. Everything had a strange name: halyards, sheets, braces, stays. You couldn't just say, "That rope over there." There were rules, and you had to memorize them quickly because mistakes were dangerous. On your first day, you'd probably spend hours just standing in the way, getting yelled at by everyone, until eventually you were given the simplest possible task, something like pumping water out of the bilge, a dark, foul-smelling pool that collected in the bottom of the ship. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe, mostly. The fear of violence, one thing that separated pirate ships from Navy vessels, was the absence of formal punishment like flogging. Pirates prided themselves on their more democratic system, but that didn't mean they were gentle. A new recruit who didn't pull his weight might find himself on the wrong end of a fist, or worse, a cutlass. Pirates had little patience for dead weight. If you were slow, lazy, or looked like you might be trouble, you could be beaten, marooned, or simply accidentally pushed overboard during a storm. This fear kept new recruits in a constant state of anxiety. Every shout felt like a threat. Every glance seemed like a judgment. And with no familiar friends or allies on board, it was easy to feel completely alone. The first battle, if you were unlucky, your first day, might also include your first battle. Pirate ships didn't sit around for long. They were always on the hunt for plunder. And when a target was spotted, there was no time for training or explanations. Suddenly, you'd be thrust into chaos, the roar of cannons, smoke so thick you could barely see, and men screaming in pain or fury. Your job, as the new guy, was simple: don't die. Maybe you would be assigned to carry ammunition, or help reload the cannons, or just keep out of the way. But the experience was terrifying. The ship rocked violently with every blast. Splinters flew like deadly darts as cannonballs smashed into the hull. And if the battle came down to boarding, well, then you'd find yourself face to face with enemy sailors, cutlasses flashing in the dim light. For many recruits, this was the moment when reality truly sank in. Piracy wasn't a grand adventure. It was brutal, bloody work where a single mistake could end you. The pirate code, a strange kind of order. After surviving that first battle, or even just the first day, a new recruit would slowly begin to understand the ship's strange social structure. Unlike Navy ships, where rank was everything, pirate crews operated under the pirate code. This was a set of rules agreed upon by the entire crew. Everyone got a vote. Plunder was divided equally, with extra shares for the captain and skilled specialists like gunners or carpenters. Even punishments were decided collectively. At first, this might feel chaotic, even anarchic, but compared to the rigid hierarchies of the Navy, it was shockingly fair. For a new recruit who had spent his old life obeying the whims of aristocrats, this system felt almost revolutionary. Of course, the code didn't protect you from everything. If the crew decided you were a problem, they could just as easily vote to maroon you on a deserted island. Democracy at sea was a double-edged sword. Homesickness and regret in the rare quiet moments, usually during the night watch. New recruits often felt the full weight of their decision. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a dark, rolling void. There was no escape, no easy way back to shore, no way to undo the choice he had made. Some men cried quietly in their hammocks. Others drank themselves into oblivion with whatever rum they could scrounge, and some just sat in silence, staring at the stars, wondering how long they would survive. For a few, this was when regret began to set in. Maybe piracy wasn't the glorious life they'd imagined. Maybe it wasn't even survivable. But by then, it was too late. Once you'd crossed the line into piracy, the only way out was death, preferably quick, and ideally not at the end of a rope. Finding a place among the crew. Over time, though, most recruits began to adapt. Humans are remarkably resilient, even in the worst conditions. You learned which ropes to pull, which pirates to avoid, and which ones might actually help you. You figured out how to balance on a swaying deck in high winds, how to keep your belongings dry, and how to steal a little extra food without getting caught. Gradually, you stopped being the new guy and started being part of the crew. And that's when the pirate life truly began, not as a dream of freedom, but as a daily grind of survival and occasional, fleeting excitement. The bridge to what comes next. In part 4, we saw why men turned pirate in the first place. Desperation, anger, and a thirst for something better than the Empire's false promises. In this part, we followed them through those first terrifying days when the romantic idea of piracy gave way to the gritty, exhausting reality. But this is only the beginning, because once a man settled into his role, he had to live by the rules of his new society, the Pirate Code. It was a strange, unique system that gave pirates both freedom and order, and it shaped everything about how they lived and fought. In Part 6, we'll drift deeper into this world of democracy at sea, exploring how pirates governed themselves, how they kept order, and what happened when someone broke the code. For now, picture our new recruit lying in his hammock, finally drifting to sleep after a long, terrifying day, his future uncertain, but his path now firmly set among the brethren of the coast. In Part 5, we followed our weary new recruit through his first confusing, terrifying days aboard a pirate ship. We saw him stumble over ropes, flinch at cannon fire, and lie awake at night wondering whether he'd made the worst mistake of his life. Now, as he settles into his new role, he begins to notice something strange. Yes, the ship is chaotic and dangerous. And yes, his crewmates are terrifying in both appearance and temperament. But there's also a surprising sense of order. Not the kind of order you'd find on a Navy ship, where officers barked commands and men obeyed without question. This was a different kind of order, one built by the pirates themselves. It was called the Pirate Code, and it was the glue that held these floating societies together. Without it, a pirate ship would have dissolved into constant mutiny and bloodshed. With it, pirates managed something truly remarkable, a working form of democracy in one of the most lawless environments imaginable. On land, the world was ruled by kings, emperors, governors, and merchants. Hierarchy was everywhere. If you were born poor, you obeyed those above you forever. It was simply the natural order of things. But aboard a pirate ship, all of that vanished. The moment you stepped onto that deck, your past life stopped mattering. It didn't matter if you'd been a lowly sailor or an aristocrat's son. Among pirates, you were just another member of the crew. This radical equality wasn't just philosophical, it was practical. Pirate crews needed every man to fight fiercely and work hard. The best way to ensure loyalty wasn't fear, it was fairness. And so they built a system where every man had a voice. Decisions were made collectively. The crew voted on where to sail, which ships to attack, and even who their captain would be. If a captain lost their confidence, they could simply vote him out. Imagine how different history might look if entire kingdoms worked that way. The pirate captain wasn't a monarch or a tyrant. He was, essentially, a temporary manager, trusted to lead during battle, but never beyond scrutiny. When things were peaceful, the quartermaster often held more day-to-day authority. The captain's main job was strategy. He directed the ship during fights, decided when to attack, and kept morale high. But if he grew arrogant, cruel, or simply unlucky, the crew could hold a vote and replace him. This created an interesting dynamic. Pirate captains had to be both charismatic and competent. They couldn't rule through fear alone, because their crew would simply stop following them. On a pirate ship, Leadership was earned, not inherited. If the captain was the military leader, the quartermaster was the civilian authority. He represented the crew's interests, made sure plunder was divided fairly, and handled disputes. Think of him as part judge, part accountant, part shipboard therapist, though with slightly more swearing and occasional swordplay. The quartermaster also managed discipline. On a Navy ship, punishment came down from the top, usually in the form of brutal floggings. But on a pirate ship, punishments were decided collectively and carried out under the quartermaster's supervision. It was a surprisingly fair system, though fair did not necessarily mean gentle. Each pirate crew wrote their own version of the code, usually in simple, blunt language. While the exact rules varied, certain themes showed up again and again. They covered everything from battle conduct to personal behavior. Common rules included equal shares of plunder. Loot was divided evenly among the crew with extra portions for officers and specialists like carpenters or surgeons. No fighting on board. Disputes had to be settled calmly or, if absolutely necessary, with a duel on land. Never on the ship itself. Lights out at 8. Pirates valued rest almost as much as rum. Once the candles were out, noise was kept to a minimum. No gambling debts. Gambling was allowed, but debts couldn't spiral out of control. A man couldn't lose everything he owned to cards or dice. Injury compensation. If a pirate was injured in battle, losing a hand, a leg, or an eye, he received financial compensation from the collective loot. This last rule might sound oddly modern, almost like workers' compensation, but for pirates, it was practical. A maimed fighter couldn't work, but he still needed food and shelter. Supporting him wasn't just kindness. It ensured loyalty and kept morale steady. Of course, when someone broke the rules, there had to be consequences. Pirate punishments were brutal, but they were also carefully measured. For minor offenses, a man might be fined or temporarily denied his share of plunder. He might also be smoked, forced to sit near the galley fire in suffocating heat as a form of mild torture. More serious crimes, like theft from the crew or cowardice in battle, could lead to marooning. This meant being left alone on a deserted island with nothing but a pistol and a small supply of water and food. It was a death sentence, though a slow and lonely one. And the worst crimes? Mutiny against the agreed-upon code or murder of a fellow crew member could result in outright execution, usually by hanging, sometimes by the far more gruesome method of being dragged beneath the ship's hull, a punishment known as keel hauling. It wasn't pleasant, but it was a system everyone understood. Justice might be rough, but it was transparent and consistent, something few sailors had ever experienced under imperial law. To us, the pirate code might sound almost utopian, a society of equals, bound by mutual agreement. But its success wasn't based on idealism alone. Pirates needed this system to survive. Their ships were small, their lives constantly at risk, and their enemies far larger and more powerful. They couldn't afford internal chaos. Every man needed to trust that his crewmates would fight alongside him and share the spoils fairly. If even a hint of favoritism or corruption crept in, the whole fragile structure could collapse. So the code wasn't just a set of rules, it was a survival mechanism. By enforcing equality, the pirates kept their tiny society stable, even in the face of overwhelming external pressure. It's worth pausing to reflect on how radical this was. On land, empires were run by hereditary rulers, corrupt governors, and distant kings who never saw the people they ruled. Common sailors were treated as disposable tools. But at sea, among the so-called villains of all nations, men had more rights than they ever did under the empire's flag. They could vote, they could demand fair treatment, they could even overthrow their leaders without fear of being executed for treason. Ironically, the pirate ship, a place feared by every government, was, in many ways, more democratic than most nations on earth. For our recruit, adjusting to this strange form of order took time. At first, it felt chaotic, even contradictory. One day, he'd see the crew voting on a matter of great importance, with solemn seriousness. The next, he'd see those same men drunkenly hurling insults over a card game. But gradually, he began to understand that this was simply how pirates lived. Freedom and structure coexisted, balanced carefully on the shifting deck of the ship. Everyone knew the rules, and everyone had agreed to them. In a world where the outside authorities offered nothing but exploitation, this was nothing short of revolutionary. In Part 4, we saw why men turned pirate: desperation, betrayal, and the lure of freedom. In Part 5, we followed their first steps into this dangerous new life. And now, in Part 6, we've explored the rules that gave shape to their floating societies. But knowing the rules is only part of the story. Next, we'll dive into the gritty, exhausting details of daily life aboard a pirate ship. Because while the pirate code might have provided fairness, it couldn't make the food taste better, or the living quarters any less cramped. In Part 7, we'll experience the full misery of life at sea: the bad meals, the sickness, and the long stretches of boredom between bursts of chaos. For now, imagine our recruit finally settling into his hammock after another grueling day, clutching his meager share of rum, and whispering a quiet thanks that, at least for tonight, he still has both his legs, both his hands, and a place among the brethren of the coast. By now, our young recruit has learned the rules of his new world. He knows when to speak and when to stay silent, how to avoid angering the quartermaster, and why the pirate code is sacred. But knowing the rules doesn't make the days any easier, because the truth, as he's beginning to discover, is that life aboard a pirate ship was miserable. Freedom may have drawn men to piracy, but comfort certainly didn't keep them there. And as the weeks drag on, the romance of being a free man of the seas fades into something far less exciting: hunger, filth, and long, aching stretches of boredom. From a distance, a pirate ship might seem impressive: sails billowing, black flag snapping in the wind. But up close, it was less majestic and more cramped. The ship was always crowded, often carrying far more men than it was designed to hold. There were no private quarters for ordinary crew members. Instead, they crammed together in the lower deck, hammocks slung side by side, swaying with every shift of the waves. The air was thick and damp, filled with the smell of salt water, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Ventilation was poor, and in the humid heat of the tropics, the below deck space could feel like a suffocating furnace. The ceilings were so low that most men couldn't stand upright. Our recruit quickly learned to duck his head or wrist, splitting it open on a beam, something every sailor managed to do at least once. Sleeping wasn't much better. Hammocks swung wildly during storms, and the constant noise of creaking wood, crashing waves, and snoring crewmates made true rest almost impossible. This wasn't a home. It was a floating cage, and one that never stopped moving. Then there was the matter of food. If you imagined pirates feasting on roasted meat and fresh fruit every night, you'd be sorely disappointed. Most meals consisted of whatever could survive weeks at sea without spoiling, which meant hardtack, salted meat, and dried peas. Hardtack was essentially a brick of flour and water baked until it was nearly indestructible. You didn't chew hardtack so much as you gnawed on it, slowly softening it with spit or soaking it in brine just to make it edible. Sometimes you'd crack one open and find it crawling with weevils. This wasn't a defect, it was simply extra protein. Salted meat wasn't much better. Over time, the salt would draw out so much moisture that the meat turned leathery and nearly inedible. And if a barrel wasn't sealed properly, the meat could rot, filling the hold with a stench so foul it made even hardened pirates gag. Fresh food was rare, usually limited to whatever fruit or vegetables they managed to steal during raids or pick up at port. When that ran out, the crew's health began to suffer, and that's when scurvy struck. Scurvy was the terror of every sailor, pirate, or otherwise. It crept up slowly, starting with swollen gums and fatigue, then progressing to open sores, tooth loss, and eventually death. The cause, a lack of vitamin C, wasn't understood at the time. To the crew, it simply seemed like a curse of the sea, striking without warning. And scurvy was only one of many dangers. Life in close quarters meant that illnesses spread quickly. A single fever could sweep through the ship, leaving men too weak to work. There were no doctors aboard, only a ship's surgeon if they were lucky, and his treatments were often more frightening than the illness itself. Amputation was common. A man with a badly infected wound might wake up to find he'd lost a leg, a hand, or both, all without the luxury of anesthesia. Rum might dull the pain, but it didn't erase the memory of the saw's teeth biting through bone. If the food and sickness didn't break a man's spirit, the vermin might. Rats scurried freely through the hold, feasting on whatever scraps they could find, including the crew's food stores. Some pirates even ate the rats when rations ran low, a grim reversal of hunter and prey. Then there were the lice and fleas, no matter how often a man washed. And to be clear, that wasn't very often. His clothes would be crawling with tiny biting insects within days. The constant itching was maddening, especially during long nights when sleep was already difficult to come by. Our recruit, like everyone else, quickly grew used to the discomfort. He learned to pick lice from his seams by firelight and to stomp rats before they could chew through a sack of flour, but he never truly stopped hating it. Ironically, for all the chaos and danger of piracy, Most days were unbearably boring. The moments of excitement, chasing a merchant ship, fighting a sea battle, celebrating a successful raid, were rare and brief. The rest of the time, life settled into a dull, repetitive routine. Days were spent repairing sails, scrubbing decks, and performing the endless small tasks needed to keep the ship afloat. The sun was relentless, baking the deck until the wood was hot enough to blister bare feet. At night, the sea stretched into black nothingness, broken only by the faint glow of lanterns. There were no books to read, no music beyond whatever crude songs the crew could sing, and no games except gambling, which was as likely to start a fight as it was to pass the time. Boredom gnawed at the men almost as much as hunger. Every now and then, something would break the monotony. A sudden storm might send the crew scrambling to secure the sails, adrenaline cutting through the boredom like lightning through the sky, or a lookout's cry of "sail ho" would send everyone rushing to their stations, hearts pounding at the prospect of plunder. These bursts of activity were thrilling, even terrifying, but they were always temporary. Once the excitement ended, the long, grinding routine resumed. Days blurred into weeks, and weeks into months, until time itself seemed to lose meaning. So how did the pirates keep from losing their minds entirely? Part of it came down to camaraderie. Shared suffering forged bonds between men, creating a strange, rough form of brotherhood. They sang together, swapped stories, and found dark humor in their misfortune. Even our recruit, who once felt like an outsider, began to feel a sense of belonging during these rare moments of laughter. It didn't make the hardships disappear, but it made them bearable. As the days wore on, our recruit began to realize a hard truth. He had traded the tyranny of naval service for the chaos of piracy, but in some ways, his life hadn't improved. The pay was better, assuming they captured enough loot, and the rules were fair. But the hunger, the sickness, and the constant threat of death, those were as real as ever. Freedom, it turned out, came at a heavy price. And for men like him, there was no going back. In Part 6, we saw how the pirate code created a fragile democracy at sea. Now, in Part 7, we've sunk deep into the grim realities of daily pirate life. Cramped quarters, foul food, and endless discomfort. But while life aboard was harsh, there was still a strange pride in being a pirate, a sense of identity shaped not by comfort, but by survival. And part of that identity was tied to what they carried with them: their clothes, their weapons, and even their tattoos. In Part 8, we'll explore what made a pirate look like a pirate, separating Hollywood myth from gritty reality. Because beneath the black flags and flashy outfits lies a far more practical and often filthier truth. When you think of a pirate ship, you might picture a sleek black vessel, sails billowing dramatically, skull and crossbones flag snapping in the wind. In reality, most pirate ships were stolen merchant ships, hastily converted for battle, and rarely well maintained. They weren't custom-built masterpieces. They were hand-me-downs. And like all hand-me-downs, they came with quirks, problems, and the occasional mysterious leak no one could quite fix. When pirates chose a ship, They weren't looking for beauty. They wanted three things: speed, maneuverability, and space. Speed was crucial because piracy relied on chasing down prey or running away from the navy. A slow ship was a death sentence. Merchant vessels were usually built to carry cargo, not to outrun pursuers, which made them perfect targets, but terrible pirate ships, unless you upgraded them. Maneuverability was equally important. Pirate crews needed to dart in and out of battle, turning sharply to position their cannons or to avoid being rammed. Heavy warships like those of the Navy could crush a pirate vessel in a direct fight, so pirates relied on agility instead of brute strength. Finally, space. The ship had to carry a large crew, far larger than a merchant ship normally needed, plus cannons, weapons, food stores, loot, and of course, rum barrels. A cramped ship meant discomfort, but it also meant having enough hands for boarding actions and repairs. Finding a vessel that checked all three boxes was rare, so pirates often made compromises. They might settle for a slightly slower ship if it had extra storage, or a fast ship that required constant repairs. Either way, it was never perfect. The most striking feature of any ship was its sails. These massive sheets of canvas weren't just decoration. They were the engines of the vessel, catching the wind and driving it forward. Maintaining the sails was a constant job. Canvas wore out quickly, especially in tropical sun and salt spray. Men spent endless hours aloft, patching holes and tying lines, often in dangerous conditions. A single ripped sail in the middle of a chase could mean disaster. The rigging, the network of ropes, pulleys, and masts looked like an incomprehensible spiderweb to outsiders. But to a sailor, every line had a name and a purpose. One wrong knot could send a mast toppling or leave the ship helpless in battle. Our recruit, still new to the life, probably found climbing into the rigging terrifying at first. Imagine swinging 50 feet above a rolling deck. Nothing but rope beneath your hands, with the sea yawning below. Over time, it became routine, though never entirely comfortable. Cannons were what made a pirate ship truly dangerous. Without them, a ship was just a floating target. With them, it became a predator. Most pirate ships carried small to medium-sized cannons, known as demi-culverins or sakers. They weren't as heavy as the massive guns mounted on Navy warships, but they were easier to maneuver and reload quickly. The goal wasn't to sink a target. That would just send all the loot to the bottom of the sea. Instead, pirates aimed to disable enemy ships by blasting holes in their sails or hulls. Cannons were notoriously finicky and dangerous. A misfired gun could explode, injuring or killing the crew operating it. And during battle, the gun deck filled with smoke so thick you could barely see a few feet ahead. The noise was deafening, the heat suffocating, and the chaos absolute. Even when not in combat, maintaining the cannons was an endless chore. They had to be cleaned, greased, and secured to prevent them from rolling across the deck in rough seas, which, incidentally, was a great way to lose a leg if you weren't paying attention. At the rear of the ship was the quarterdeck, where the captain and officers commanded during battle or navigation. From here, Orders were shouted down to the crew, often with a healthy dose of profanity to make sure they were heard over the wind. Beneath the quarterdeck was the captain's cabin, which, in theory, was a private space. In practice, it was only slightly more comfortable than the crew's quarters. Yes, there might be a small table and a bed rather than a hammock, but it was still cramped, damp, and perpetually rocking. The captain's cabin also served as a storage space for maps, navigation tools, and whatever loot was too fragile or valuable to toss into the general hold. Sometimes it doubled as a council room where important decisions were made, like whether to chase a prize or when to make port for repairs. Below decks was where the ship's reality hit hardest. This was the crew's domain, and it was unpleasant, to put it mildly. The lower deck was dark and poorly ventilated. Lanterns provided some light, but they also carried the constant risk of fire, a nightmare scenario on a wooden ship filled with gunpowder. The smell was indescribable, a mix of sweat, mildew, unwashed clothes, rotting food, and the pungent tang of human waste. Sanitation was practically non-existent. To relieve themselves, sailors used buckets or simply leaned over the side of the ship, which was risky for obvious reasons. One slip, and you were overboard, and no one was turning the ship around for you. Rats and cockroaches thrived in these conditions, scurrying through the hold and nesting in the food stores. The crew fought a constant battle to keep them under control, though victory was never permanent. One of the most dangerous areas of the ship was the powder magazine, a small, heavily guarded room where gunpowder was stored. Even a single spark here could destroy the entire vessel. For this reason, only a few trusted men were allowed inside, and they had to remove their boots to prevent accidental sparks. They worked by candlelight, often shielded by glass lanterns to reduce the risk of open flame. Despite these precautions, accidents still happened, and when they did, there was usually no one left to tell the tale. Wooden ships required constant maintenance. Saltwater corroded metal, sails tore, ropes frayed, and hulls sprang leaks. A pirate crew spent as much time repairing their ship as they did sailing or fighting. If a mast broke during a storm, it had to be replaced, sometimes while the ship was still being tossed by waves. If the hull was damaged in battle, men had to crawl into the cramped, filthy space beneath the waterline to patch it. It was dangerous, exhausting work, and failure meant sinking. For pirates, there was no Navy shipyard waiting to help them. They had to be their own carpenters, blacksmiths, and engineers, or risk being stranded in the middle of the ocean. Finally, we come to the most famous part of a pirate ship, the Jolly Roger, that iconic skull and crossbones flag. It wasn't flown all the time. In fact, pirates usually approached targets under false flags, pretending to be merchants or Navy ships until they were close enough to strike. Only then would they raise the black flag, a silent warning that surrender was expected, or else. Different crews had different designs. Some flags showed skeletons, bleeding hearts, or hourglasses to symbolize the fleeting nature of life. The goal wasn't just to frighten the enemy, but to create a reputation that would make future victims surrender without a fight. Ironically, this simple piece of cloth may have saved more lives than it ended. A merchant captain who saw the Jolly Roger knew that resistance was useless and that cooperation might spare his crew. A pirate ship was a paradox, a place of freedom built on strict rules, a tool of violence that also served as a fragile home. It was both a sanctuary and a death trap, depending on the day and the weather. A recruit, still finding his place among the crew, came to see the ship as more than just wood and sails. It was a living thing, unpredictable, temperamental, and utterly essential to their survival. When it creaked in the night, he swore it was whispering secrets only the sea could understand. In Part 8, we've explored the physical heart of pirate life, the ship itself. We've seen its strengths, its weaknesses, and the constant battle to keep it afloat. But a ship is only as fearsome as the men who sail it, and part of a pirate's identity came from what he carried on his back and at his side. Next, in Part 9, we'll look at the gear of a pirate, their clothes, weapons, and tattoos. Because while Hollywood has given us an image of pirates decked out in plumed hats and gold-trimmed coats, the truth was far more practical and much, much dirtier. The first thing to understand about pirate fashion is that there was no official uniform. Pirates didn't have supply chains or a royal tailor waiting at port with fresh outfits. Instead, they wore whatever they could get, stolen from captured ships, stripped from dead enemies, or traded for in bustling colonial markets. This created a wild mix of clothing styles. A single crew might include English sailors in rough canvas shirts, Frenchmen in striped linen, and runaway slaves wearing whatever scraps they'd escaped in. Practicality always won out over appearance. If something kept you warm, dry, or alive, you wore it. If it didn't, you threw it overboard. The core of a pirate's wardrobe was simple: loose shirts, sturdy trousers, and a belt or sash. The shirts were usually made of linen or coarse cotton, chosen because they dried quickly after getting soaked, which happened constantly at sea. These shirts weren't clean, and they certainly weren't fashionable. They were work clothes, often patched and mended until barely recognizable. Trousers, or breeches, were cut short to avoid tangling in ropes or dragging through filthy deck water. Many pirates went barefoot, preferring calloused feet over heavy boots that might slip on wet planks. Shoes, if they were worn at all, were usually simple leather ones with no adornment. Around the waist, a long sash or belt held knives, pistols, or tools. Sashes also doubled as makeshift bandages or rope when needed. Brightly colored cloth, reds, blues, and yellows, was popular for sashes, not because pirates were flamboyant, but because bold colors were easier to see in the chaos of battle. Contrary to popular belief, not every pirate wore a dramatic tricorn hat. Those were expensive and often impractical on a windy deck. Most pirates stuck with simple wool caps or bandanas. Bandanas weren't just for style. They kept sweat out of the eyes and provided a layer of protection from the relentless sun. On rare occasions, a captain or quartermaster might wear a fine hat taken from a captured officer, but this was more about status than utility. If you saw a man with a plumed, wide-brimmed hat, you could safely assume he'd taken it off someone wealthier and probably deader than himself. One often overlooked fact about piracy is that clothing was valuable loot. When a crew captured a merchant ship, they didn't just take gold and rum. They raided the crew's trunks, seizing coats, trousers, boots, and anything that might be worth wearing or selling later. This is why pirates sometimes appeared more colorful than other sailors, not because they were theatrical, but because their clothing came from all over the world. A single pirate might wear Dutch breeches, a Spanish sash, and a French coat, all layered together in a mismatched, chaotic ensemble. If someone looked particularly pirate-y, it was less about fashion sense and more about luck and plundering. Clothing kept a pirate alive through sun and storm. Weapons kept him alive through battle. And every pirate carried several. The most common weapon was the cutlass, a short, curved sword ideal for fighting in the cramped, chaotic environment of a ship. Long swords were too cumbersome. A cutlass could slash, stab, and parry in close quarters. It wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. Next came the pistol. Pirate pistols were single-shot, muzzle-loading firearms, slow to reload, and not particularly accurate. In battle, a pirate might carry 2, 3, or even 4 pistols tucked into his belt or sash. The idea was simple. Fire one, drop it, grab another. Reloading could wait until after the fight. Knives and daggers were also common, serving both as weapons and as all-purpose tools. A good blade could cut rope, carve wood, or settle a gambling dispute, often all in the same day. One weapon unique to ship combat was the boarding axe. This wasn't a lumberjack's tool. It was lighter, sharper, and designed for brutal efficiency. Pirates used boarding axes to hack through rigging, smash open doors, or pull down enemy sails during a chase. They were also terrifying in hand-to-hand combat. Few things inspire panic, quite like a man swinging an axe while screaming over the crash of waves. A fully armed pirate could look almost absurd. Imagine a man with 2 pistols, a cutlass, a dagger, and perhaps even a small axe, all strapped to his body at once. It wasn't comfortable, but it gave him options. There was a reason pirates loaded themselves like walking arsenals. Naval battles were short, chaotic affairs. You didn't have time to reload or strategize. You grabbed whatever weapon was at hand and hoped to still be standing when the smoke cleared. Perhaps the most personal part of a pirate's appearance was his tattoos. These weren't the elaborate full-body designs we see today, but simple, crude markings done with improvised tools and ink. Tattoos served several purposes. Some marked a man's origin, a small anchor for a life at sea, a cross for faith, or initials for a loved one left behind. Others were purely symbolic, skulls, daggers, hearts, or stars. A few tattoos were meant to be superstitious charms, warding off bad luck or guiding the soul to heaven if the body sank to the bottom of the ocean. In many ways, tattoos were a pirate's only form of permanent ownership. Clothes could be lost, weapons stolen, ships sunk, but a tattoo stayed with you, even in death. While we've talked about what pirates wore and carried, there's one detail we can't ignore: the smell. Imagine layers of unwashed sweat, rotting leather, old blood, and salt soaked cloth. Now add the constant smoke of cannon fire, the stink of tar and pitch, and the occasional whiff of rotting food or vomit. That was the scent of a pirate ship. Even before you saw pirates coming, you might smell them on the wind, a detail the history books rarely mention, but one their victims surely never forgot. It's worth noting that captains and quartermasters often dressed differently than ordinary crewmen. A captain might wear a stolen naval coat or a fine pair of boots, partly to display authority and partly as a way to intimidate targets. But even the fanciest pirate captain was never spotless. Saltwater didn't care how expensive your coat was. Every pirate, from the lowest deckhand to the most feared captain, ended up equally soaked, stained, and filthy after a few weeks at sea. By now, it's easy to see how our modern image of the pirate came to be. Take a ragtag group of men in mismatched clothing, add a few dramatic hats and sashes, sprinkle in some fearsome weapons, and you have the beginnings of legend. Over time, storytellers exaggerated the look, turning practical outfits into costumes and simple weapons into symbols of freedom and rebellion. But beneath the myth, the reality was simple. Pirates dressed to survive, not to impress. In Part 9, we've explored the personal side of piracy, the clothes, weapons, and tattoos that defined a pirate's outward identity. These details bring us closer to the individuals behind the stories, showing us not just how they fought, but how they lived, and even how they saw themselves. But while Hollywood loves to show pirates burying treasure and hoarding gold, the truth about pirate wealth was far stranger and far more disappointing. In Part 10, we'll unravel the greatest myth of all, the buried treasure legend, and why, for most pirates, treasure was never more than a fleeting handful of coins, and sometimes a bottle of rum. Let's be honest, the legend is tempting. A secret island, a map passed down through generations, a chest overflowing with gold coins, sparkling jewels, and priceless relics. It has all the drama of a fairy tale, which is exactly why it caught on. But actual pirates didn't live in fairy tales. They lived on crowded, filthy ships, where survival was always uncertain and loyalty was often paper thin. When they got their hands on treasure, they weren't thinking about hiding it for later. They were thinking about spending it as fast as possible. There are several practical reasons why pirates didn't bury their loot, and they all come down to simple logic. First, pirates didn't trust each other that much. Imagine a group of men, most of whom were criminals or desperate sailors, agreeing to bury a chest of gold somewhere and then just leaving it there, assuming no one would sneak back later to steal it. That's not exactly a solid plan. Second, piracy was a dangerous career with a very short life expectancy. Most pirates didn't live long enough to enjoy retirement, let alone to carefully plan a long-term investment strategy. As the saying went, a pirate's future was either a hangman's rope or a cannonball in the gut. Neither outcome encouraged saving for later. Finally, there was the issue of simple practicality, carrying loot ashore, burying it, And making a map took time, time when the ship was vulnerable. Why bother when you could spend the loot immediately in a nearby port on things that felt much more urgent? Food, clothing, weapons, gambling, and, of course, rum. So, what did treasure actually look like for most pirates? It wasn't gold coins and jewels, it was cargo. The majority of ships they captured were merchant vessels carrying ordinary goods: barrels of flour, bolts of cloth, crates of tobacco, or casks of wine. Sometimes they carried weapons, livestock, or even human beings if the ship was part of the slave trade. These things weren't glamorous, but they were valuable. Pirates looted whatever they could sell or use. Grain fed the crew. Cloth could be traded for supplies. Alcohol was both drinkable and sellable, often doubling as makeshift currency. On rare occasions, a pirate crew might hit the jackpot by seizing a ship carrying coins, silver, or gold dust. But even then, they didn't hold on to it for long. As soon as they reached a friendly port, the money was divided according to the pirate code: captain, quartermaster, and other officers taking slightly larger shares, while every crewman got an equal cut. Once a man had his share, he was free to do whatever he wanted with it. And what he usually wanted to do was spend it immediately. Picture a pirate ship pulling into a remote Caribbean port or a lawless harbor like Nassau in the Bahamas. The crew, half starved and filthy from months at sea, disembarks with pockets full of freshly stolen wealth. What happens next is predictable and chaotic. There were taverns, gambling houses, brothels, and merchants ready to sell everything from new boots to exotic pets. Prices were outrageous, but pirates didn't care. They knew their next battle might be their last, so the goal was to live while they could. This is why pirate crews often went from riches to poverty in a matter of days. One week, they might be celebrating with barrels of wine and elaborate feasts. The next, they were broke again, forced to risk another raid just to keep going. Some historians have compared this to the lifestyle of modern professional athletes or lottery winners: a sudden windfall followed by reckless spending. The difference is that a pirate's career rarely lasted more than a few years before ending violently. All that said, there are a handful of exceptions. A very few famous pirates might have actually buried their wealth, not because they wanted to come back for it later, but because they were about to be captured or executed and didn't want their enemies to have it. The most famous example is Captain William Kidd, who in the late 1600s supposedly buried treasure on Gardiner's Island off the coast of New York. When Kidd was arrested, officials searched frantically for his hidden hoard, and some of it was indeed found, though far less than the legends claimed. Even in Kidd's case, the treasure wasn't buried for adventure or secrecy. It was a last-ditch attempt to hide stolen goods from the authorities. Other stories of buried treasure, Blackbeard's hidden gold, for instance, are almost entirely fictional, fueled by centuries of tall tales and popular novels. So how did we end up with this romantic image of pirates burying treasure? The answer lies in storytelling, not history. The most influential culprit was Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, Treasure Island, published in 1883. Stevenson's tale featured maps marked with X's, hidden chests, and a scheming one-legged pirate named Long John Silver. It was wildly popular, shaping how generations of readers imagined piracy. Before Treasure Island, the concept of buried treasure barely existed in popular culture. After it, it became the defining pirate myth, so much so that even today, many people assume it must have been common practice. Hollywood films and adventure stories piled on, cementing the image in our collective imagination. The truth that pirates mostly spent their loot on rum and gambling was simply less exciting. Understanding the reality of pirate wealth also helps explain why piracy existed at all. Most sailors were paid pitiful wages, often delayed for months or stolen outright by corrupt captains and governments. Becoming a pirate offered the chance to earn far more money, far more quickly. For example, a sailor on a merchant ship might make a few pounds a year. A pirate, after a single successful raid, could walk away with 10 times that amount in a single day. Of course, this wealth was unstable and dangerous, but for men who had spent years barely scraping by, the temptation was impossible to resist. In this sense, piracy wasn't just about rebellion or freedom. It was about economic desperation, fueled by a world that treated common sailors as disposable. This cycle, theft, spending, poverty, and theft again, defined the pirate life. It was a constant loop, with no real way to break free. Few pirates retired with savings or lived to enjoy their riches. Most ended their lives the same way they began, broke, hungry, and at the mercy of forces far bigger than themselves. Our recruit, now fully integrated into the crew, would have experienced this firsthand. The first time he held his share of plunder, he might have felt a rush of excitement. He could finally buy food, clothes, maybe even a night or two of revelry on shore. But within days, it would be gone. And the only way to get more was to risk everything again. In part 10, we've stripped away one of the most beloved pirate myths, the fantasy of buried treasure. The reality was far more chaotic. Wealth stolen, spent recklessly, and then stolen again in an endless, dangerous cycle. But while pirates didn't bury their gold, they did cling to superstitions. Life at sea was uncertain and terrifying, and belief in omens, charms, and strange rituals helped them cope with the constant threat of death. In part 11, we'll explore the fascinating world of pirate superstitions, from lucky tattoos to cursed ships, and discover how myth and magic shape the daily lives of these desperate men. We gently peeled back the layers of one of the most famous pirate myths, the idea of buried treasure. We discovered that pirates didn't leave secret maps with giant red X's, and their treasure was far more likely to be a barrel of rum than a chest of gold coins. But while pirates didn't stash their wealth beneath palm trees, they did bury something else, at least metaphorically, their deepest fears and hopes, hidden beneath a tangled web of strange beliefs. Because when you live a life surrounded by chaos, death, and the unforgiving ocean, you need some kind of framework to make sense of it all. For pirates, that framework often came in the form of superstition. Let's drift into that shadowy world now, a world where every bird might be a messenger of doom, every tattoo a charm against death, and every whispered tale held the power to calm or terrify an entire crew. To truly understand why pirates were so superstitious, we need to return to the basic realities of their existence. Life at sea was terrifyingly unpredictable. One moment, the sky was clear and the wind was gentle. The next, a storm could rise out of nowhere, tearing sails to shreds and tossing men overboard like rag dolls. And unlike battles on land, there was no safe escape, no sturdy ground to run toward. The sea was both a home and a prison, and when it decided to turn against you, there was nothing you could do. Pirates lived with this knowledge every single day, and while cannons and cutlasses could protect them from other ships, nothing could protect them from the whims of the ocean itself. So they turned to rituals, symbols, and old sailors' tales, fragile attempts to control what was uncontrollable. One of the most deeply rooted beliefs among sailors was the idea that certain animals carried messages from the spiritual world. For pirates, no creature was more significant than the seagull. Seagulls were thought to embody the souls of dead sailors. If a gull flew close to the ship, it meant that the spirits of the departed were watching over the crew. But harming a seagull? That was considered a direct insult to the dead, practically begging for disaster. Kill a gull, and you might doom your entire voyage. And then there were albatrosses, those great, sweeping seabirds that followed ships for miles. They were seen as mysterious guides, almost divine in nature. If an albatross circled your vessel, it was a good omen, a sign of safe passage. But if one was injured or killed, misfortune would strike with terrifying speed. This belief was so powerful that it later inspired Samuel Taylor Coleridge's haunting poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in which a sailor brings ruin upon himself by killing an albatross. The poem wasn't pure invention. It was built on very real fears held by countless seafarers. Another curious superstition involved whistling. On land, whistling was harmless, maybe even cheerful. But on a ship, it carried an entirely different meaning. Many pirates believed that whistling on deck could summon the wind. In calm weather, this might be useful, a way to encourage a favorable breeze. But in stormy conditions, whistling was strictly forbidden. Doing so was seen as taunting the sea, almost daring it to unleash a hurricane. So if you were a new recruit who started whistling while swabbing the deck, you'd likely be tackled by a furious crewmate before you could get through the first note. It wasn't just about tradition. It was about survival, or at least the illusion of it. Back in part 9, we explored pirate tattoos as a form of personal expression and identity. But for many sailors, tattoos weren't just decoration. They were magical protection. A common design was the nautical star, a symbol meant to guide a sailor safely home. Another was the anchor, representing stability and a safe return to port. These weren't just artistic choices. They were talismans carried on the skin like portable charms. Some tattoos were more explicit in their intent. A small cross inked on the foot was thought to prevent sharks from attacking. A tattoo of Jesus on the chest supposedly protected the wearer from musket balls during battle, though this belief was rarely tested successfully. In a world where death lurked around every corner, tattoos gave pirates a sense of control. Even if the magic wasn't real, the belief in it was powerful enough to provide comfort. Superstition didn't just apply to individual pirates. Entire ships carried their own layers of myth and ritual. The naming of a ship was a solemn event. A poorly chosen name could doom the vessel before it ever touched the water. Names that invoked destruction, words like fury, revenge, or devil's tooth, were sometimes chosen deliberately to intimidate enemies, but they were also risky, tempting fate in dangerous ways. If a ship had been renamed, especially if it had been captured from another crew, this was seen as incredibly unlucky. To avoid disaster, pirates would often perform a ritual cleansing, which might involve burning scraps of the old sails, throwing coins into the sea as offerings, or even holding a mock funeral for the ship's former identity. These rituals weren't about logic. They were about creating a sense of order in a world ruled by chaos. One of the eeriest beliefs at sea was the idea of ghost ships, vessels crewed by the dead, forever doomed to sail without rest. Sightings of these spectral ships were considered dire omens. The most famous of these legends is the Flying Dutchman, a phantom ship said to appear in stormy waters, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. To see it was to invite disaster, while most ghost ship tales were born from fog, moonlight, and tired imaginations. The effect they had on morale was very real. A crew already on edge might descend into panic if someone claimed to have seen a cursed vessel on the horizon. This fear wasn't entirely irrational. After all, plenty of ships did vanish mysteriously at sea. And when you have no explanation, sometimes a supernatural one is easier to accept. Death was a constant presence aboard a pirate ship. Battles, disease, storms, all could claim lives suddenly and brutally. And yet, pirates developed specific rituals to handle this grim reality. When a crewmate died, his body was usually sewn into a piece of canvas, often with the last stitch passing through his nose to ensure he wasn't just unconscious. A cannonball might be tied to his feet to help him sink. Then, in a quiet, solemn moment, the body would be slid overboard, accompanied by whatever words the crew could muster. These funerals were deeply significant for men who spent their lives on shifting waters. The ocean was both grave and afterlife. Treating it with respect was essential, both to honor the dead and to keep their ghosts from haunting the living. Superstitions also shape the smaller rhythms of daily life. Some pirates carried lucky charms, small bones, coins with holes in them, or bits of wood from a previous shipwreck. Others refused to cut their hair during a voyage, fearing it would cut their luck. Rum played its part as well, though in a more practical way. While it certainly numbed fear, some pirates believed it also protected them spiritually, like liquid courage mixed with sacred ritual. A shot of rum before battle wasn't just about fortifying the body. It was a way to appease the sea and the spirits alike. To modern ears, many of these beliefs sound quaint or silly, but for pirates, they served a vital purpose. Superstitions provided structure in a life without guarantees. They gave meaning to random tragedy and helped maintain discipline on a ship full of volatile, desperate men. If a bad storm struck, it wasn't because nature was cruel. It was because someone had whistled on deck or killed an albatross. That sense of cause and effect, however illogical, was deeply comforting. In a way, these superstitions were like an unwritten pirate code of the spirit, invisible rules that kept the crew's sanity intact. As we've seen, the pirate life was built on belief as much as violence. Superstitions shaped everything from tattoos to funerals, giving pirates a fragile sense of safety in a hostile world. But there were moments when those fears gave way to celebration, brief windows of wild, joyous living. Because even the most hardened pirates couldn't spend every waking moment staring death in the face. They needed to relax, to laugh, to forget their misery, even if only for a night or two. Next, we'll explore the fleeting joys of pirate life, rum-soaked shore leave, gambling, and the rare occasions when a crew could finally let loose. It was a messy, temporary escape, but for these men, it was everything. We drifted through the mysterious world of pirate superstition, a realm where seagulls were sacred, whistling could summon storms, and tattoos served as spiritual armor. Those beliefs gave pirates a sense of control, a fragile comfort in the face of death and chaos. But even the most superstitious man needs more than rituals to survive. He needs moments of escape, brief stretches of time where the fear fades, the rules relax, and life almost feels worth living. For pirates, those moments came in the form of rum, gambling, and shore leave. Tonight, we'll follow our weary recruit as he experiences his first real taste of the pirate version of fun. And as you'll see, even their good days were complicated. For weeks, our recruit has endured the misery of life aboard, rancid food, cramped quarters, and the constant itch of lice beneath his shirt. Days have blurred into nights, and nights into a single, endless haze of labor and boredom. But now, there's a shift in the air. A low murmur ripples through the crew as the lookout calls down from the mast. Land ho! That phrase carries more than just the promise of dry ground. It means fresh food, real drink, and a few precious hours of freedom. It means shore leave and the wild chaos that comes with it. The men move with a new energy as they guide the ship toward the harbor. Even the ship itself seems to groan with relief, sails flapping like tired lungs after a long sprint. Our recruit doesn't know exactly what to expect, but he can tell from the gleam in his crewmate's eyes that tonight will be different. Before we dive into the madness of shore leave, it's worth mentioning that pirates didn't have to wait for land to indulge in their favorite pastime, drinking. Unlike naval sailors, whose rum was carefully rationed and watered down into something called grog, pirates usually drank as much as they pleased, at least when supplies allowed it. Rum was the drink of choice for a simple reason. It didn't spoil. Fresh water turned foul quickly in the heat of the tropics, developing a taste somewhere between pond slime and rotten eggs. But rum? Rum stayed good forever, and more importantly, it took the edge off a life filled with fear and hardship. Of course, this lack of control came at a price. A drunken sailor was a danger to himself and everyone else. So while the pirate code allowed drinking, there were usually rules about when and how much. Crews that ignored those rules entirely often descended into chaos or mutiny. Still, rum was a constant presence on the ship. It was medicine, currency, and escape, all poured into the same chipped wooden cup. As the ship approaches port, the anticipation builds. From the deck, the crew can see the outline of low buildings, the smoke of cooking fires, and the faint glow of lanterns in the gathering dusk. This isn't a grand city or a well-ordered harbor. It's a pirate haven, a rough, lawless settlement where a man can spend his ill-gotten gains without too many questions being asked. Places like Port Royal in Jamaica or Nassau in the Bahamas were legendary for their mix of taverns, brothels, and traders willing to look the other way. For our recruit, the sight is intoxicating. It's the first time in months he's seen solid ground, let alone the promise of good food and drink that as soon as the anchor drops, the men spill onto the dock like a tide of ragged, shouting figures. They are ready to celebrate and to forget the sea, at least for one night. The first stop for nearly every pirate was the tavern. These were cramped, smoky rooms packed with rough wooden tables, sticky floors, and an overwhelming smell of sweat, alcohol, and fried fish. The noise is deafening: laughter, curses, shouts, and the constant clatter of mugs slamming on tables. Music drifts through the air, usually from a battered fiddle or a sailor pounding out a rhythm on an overturned barrel. And everywhere there is rum. It flows freely, splashing across tables and down beards. For a pirate who's been surviving on ship's rations, the first sip of strong, undiluted liquor feels almost magical. Of course, drinking is rarely done in moderation. Within an hour, men are singing bawdy songs, dancing unsteadily, and occasionally collapsing in heaps beneath the tables. Fights break out just as easily. A spilled drink, a cheated bet, or an insult shouted across the room can escalate into a full-blown brawl. The tavern owner doesn't mind. As long as the coins keep clinking on the counter, the chaos is just part of the atmosphere. Once the first wave of drunkenness hits, many pirates turn to gambling. After all, they've spent months risking their lives for loot, and now it's time to risk that loot on a game of chance. The games are simple: dice, cards, or improvised contests like knife throwing or coin flipping. But the stakes are high. A man might win a month's worth of plunder in a single hand, or lose everything he owns in the space of an hour. Our recruit watches nervously as a crewmate wagers a golden ring. Then another man slams down a pistol as his bet. The tension is palpable, the air thick with smoke and sweat. No one speaks above a whisper, and when the dice are finally rolled, the entire room erupts, either in laughter or violence, depending on who wins. It's worth noting that gambling wasn't just entertainment. It was a pressure valve, a way for men to release the constant tension of life at sea. But it was also a source of bitter grudges. Many a duel or mutiny had its roots in a game of dice gone wrong. For a few brief hours or days, if the captain was generous, pirates could live like kings. They ate fresh food, drank strong rum, and spent their coins as if there would be no tomorrow. Some bought flashy clothes or jewelry, eager to stand out in the crowd. Others visited brothels, seeking the comfort of human company after months of isolation. Still others simply found a quiet corner to sit and breathe air that wasn't thick with salt and sweat. But these pleasures were temporary, and everyone knew it. The coins would run out, the ship would need to sail again, and the next voyage might be the one that ended in capture or death. Perhaps that was why pirates spent so recklessly. Why save for a future that might never come? Inevitably, the night of celebration gave way to the morning after, and it was never pretty. As the sun rose, hungover pirates stumbled back to the docks, faces pale, heads pounding. Some returned penniless, having gambled or drunk away every last coin. Others bore fresh bruises or missing teeth, evidence of tavern fights they couldn't quite remember. The recruit, nursing his own aching head, began to understand why older pirates called shore leave a double-edged sword. It was a release, yes, but also a danger. Too much indulgence could leave a man weak, broke, or vulnerable, and at sea, weakness was a luxury no one could afford. Eventually, the captain would sound the call to return. Reluctant pirates dragged themselves aboard, casting longing glances back at the shore. The ship would smell even worse than usual as it filled with hungover men and their new purchases, gaudy hats, questionable weapons, and the occasional chicken clucking miserably in a stolen cage. As the sails unfurled and the harbor receded into the distance, the brief dream of freedom dissolved. Once again, the endless horizon stretched ahead, and the grim routine of piracy resumed. These moments of release might seem reckless or pointless. Why risk everything for a night of drinking and gambling? But in a life as harsh as piracy, they were essential. Without them, morale would collapse. The men needed something to look forward to, a promise of joy, however fleeting, to balance the misery of their daily existence. For our recruit, that first shore leave was a revelation. It showed him that piracy wasn't just about violence and survival. It was also about living intensely, even if only for a short time. We've explored the rare good days, the moments when pirates could laugh, gamble, and drink themselves into oblivion. But not every pirate story was about fleeting pleasures. Some individuals carved their names into history through daring deeds, clever tactics, and sheer audacity. Next, we'll meet one of the most infamous pirates of them all, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. We'll set aside the legends and look closely at the real man behind the myth and discover why his shadow still looms so large over the age of piracy. We followed our weary recruit through his first real taste of pirate leisure, a wild night of rum, gambling, and fleeting freedom on shore. But as the hangover faded and the ship returned to sea, our story shifts to something larger. Not every pirate faded anonymously into history. Some became legends, their names whispered in fear, even centuries later. And among them, none looms larger than Edward Teach, the man we know as Blackbeard. Tonight, we will strip away the tall tales and ghost stories to reveal the real Blackbeard, a cunning leader, a terrifying strategist, and, surprisingly, a man whose greatest weapon wasn't his sword, but his reputation. If you've heard of Blackbeard, you've probably imagined a giant, bloodthirsty monster, a wild-eyed killer who burned ships for fun and murdered anyone who crossed him. But the truth, like the man himself, is more complicated. Edward Teach wasn't born a pirate. Like many others, he likely started as a common sailor in the British Navy or aboard privateer vessels during wartime. The exact details of his early life are fuzzy. Even his real last name is debated. But by the early 1700s, he had found his way to the Caribbean, where the Golden Age of Piracy was reaching its peak. And there, amid chaos and opportunity, Edward Teach reinvented himself as Blackbeard. Blackbeard's most brilliant move wasn't a battle or a heist. It was the persona he created. He understood something vital. Fear could win battles before a single shot was fired. So, he carefully cultivated an image designed to terrify his enemies. He grew a thick, black beard that covered most of his face, unusual at a time when most men were clean-shaven. Before combat, he would weave slow-burning fuses into his hair and beard, then light them. As the smoke curled around his head, it gave him a demonic, almost supernatural appearance. Imagine being a merchant sailor, looking across the water to see a towering figure with flaming hair and eyes obscured by smoke. Would you fight or surrender immediately? Most chose surrender. Blackbeard's rise to power was rapid. In 1717, he captured a large French slave ship and transformed it into his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. With 40 guns and a crew of over 300 men, it became one of the most fearsome pirate ships in the Caribbean. This wasn't just about firepower, it was about presence. When the Queen Anne's Revenge appeared on the horizon, merchant captains often struck their colors without resistance. Better to hand over their cargo than risk being sunk. Blackbeard understood that violence was costly. If a crew surrendered peacefully, he often let them go unharmed. But if they resisted, the smoke, the cannons, and the sheer chaos of his attack would crush them swiftly. This made him efficient and incredibly successful. Unlike the drunken, reckless stereotype of pirates we often imagine, Blackbeard was calculated. He wasn't a mindless killer. In fact, there are surprisingly few confirmed accounts of him murdering captives outright. His goal was simple: wealth and control. The more terrified his enemies were of him, the less actual fighting he had to do. His reputation was a weapon, and he wielded it carefully. At his peak, he commanded multiple ships and ruled over entire stretches of sea, operating almost like a floating kingdom. For a brief moment, Blackbeard wasn't just a pirate. He was a power broker, negotiating with corrupt governors and trading goods openly in certain ports. But such power always comes at a price. One of Blackbeard's most famous exploits was the blockade of Charleston, South Carolina, in May 1718. For nearly a week, his fleet controlled the harbor, seizing incoming ships and holding the entire city hostage. His demand wasn't gold or treasure, it was medicine, a reminder that even pirates needed supplies to survive. The stunt worked. The city delivered the medicine, and Blackbeard sailed away, having humiliated one of the largest colonies in the region without firing a single shot. This event cemented his reputation. From that moment on, his name spread far and wide, becoming a symbol of the uncontrollable chaos of piracy. But legends cannot last forever. By late 1718, colonial governments and the British Crown had grown tired of the pirate menace. Powerful naval forces were dispatched to hunt them down, and Blackbeard became one of their top targets. He accepted a temporary pardon, pretending to retire from piracy, but retirement didn't suit him. Soon, he returned to sea, this time operating on a smaller scale, but his enemies were closing in. On November 22nd, 1718, Blackbeard's story reached its bloody end. Off the coast of North Carolina, at a narrow inlet called Ocracoke, Blackbeard's small force was ambushed by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the British Navy. The battle was fierce and brutal. Blackbeard, towering and smoke-wreathed, fought like a man possessed. According to witnesses, he suffered 5 gunshot wounds and over 20 sword cuts before finally falling. Even in death, he was terrifying. Maynard later displayed Blackbeard's severed head on the bow of his ship as proof of victory, a grim warning to any pirates who still dared defy the crown. With Blackbeard's death, a chapter of pirate history closed, but his legend only grew stronger. Why does Blackbeard's story endure when so many others faded into obscurity? Perhaps because he understood something fundamental about human nature. Fear is the greatest weapon of all. He didn't need to sink every ship or slaughter every enemy. He just needed to make people believe he could, and that belief spread like wildfire. Even today, more than 300 years later, his name conjures images of dark sails, roaring cannons, and a shadowy figure with smoke curling from his beard. As our recruit listens to tales of Blackbeard around the ship's fire, he begins to see the deeper truth of piracy. It isn't just about stealing or fighting. It's about power, image, and the fragile balance between chaos and order. He wonders if he will ever rise to such heights, or if he will be swallowed by the sea like so many nameless men before him. But before he can ponder further, he hears whispers of another story, not of a towering bearded figure, but of 2 women who shattered every expectation of their time. Next, we'll meet Anne Bonny and Mary Read, 2 pirates whose lives were as tangled and surprising as the seas they sailed. We sailed through the smoke and fire of Blackbeard's legend, seeing how one man used fear and cunning to carve his name into history. Blackbeard was larger than life, a towering figure, both literally and metaphorically. But the world of piracy wasn't just filled with towering men and booming cannons. Sometimes, the most fascinating stories are quieter, stranger, and far more complicated. Tonight, we drift from the thunder of battle to something far more subtle, and in many ways, even more remarkable. The tale of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, 2 women who stepped outside the strict boundaries of their world to live as pirates. Their story is one of disguise, deception, and defiance. And while history has blurred the lines between truth and legend, the fragments we have left reveal lives far more complex than the romanticized versions told in books and films. To understand why Anne Bonny and Mary Read's stories are so extraordinary, we need to step back for a moment. The early 1700s were not a kind time for women, especially at sea. Sailing ships were almost entirely male domains. Women were considered bad luck aboard ship, a superstition deeply rooted in maritime culture. On land, women had few legal rights. They couldn't easily own property, control their finances, or even decide their futures in many cases. In other words, the deck was quite literally stacked against them. So, for two women to not only join pirate crews, but rise to active, respected positions among them, it was practically unthinkable. And perhaps that's why their names survived when so many others were lost. Mary Read's life began with deception. She was born to a poor Englishwoman whose husband had disappeared, possibly dead, possibly just gone. Mary's mother, desperate to secure financial support from her late husband's family, disguised young Mary as a boy so she could pass as the family's rightful heir. This early masquerade shaped Mary's entire life. Raised as a boy, she found more opportunities than she ever would have had as a girl. She even joined the army disguised as a man, serving bravely in battle without her true identity being discovered. Eventually, she fell in love with a fellow soldier, revealed her secret, and married him. For a brief time, she lived openly as a woman, but when her husband died, circumstances forced her back into disguise. Once again, she dressed as a man and returned to the only life she knew, sailing and soldiering. By the time she found her way to piracy, Mary was no stranger to reinvention. Her life was, quite literally, a performance. Anne Bonny's path to piracy was different, though no less dramatic. She was the illegitimate daughter of a wealthy Irish landowner and his servant, a scandalous situation at the time. Her father eventually moved to the Americas, settling in what is now South Carolina, where Anne grew up with more freedom and more fire than most young women of her era. Anne was known for her temper. Contemporary reports, which may or may not be exaggerated, claimed she once attacked a servant girl with a knife, and on another occasion, she supposedly beat a man who insulted her. Whether those stories are true or not, they paint a picture of a woman unwilling to sit quietly and obey the rules. When Anne came of age, she was expected to marry respectably and settle into a life of domesticity. Instead, she married a penniless sailor named James Bonny, much to her father's displeasure. The marriage was stormy, and Anne soon found herself restless and drawn to the wild, lawless world of Nassau, a pirate haven in the Bahamas. It was in Nassau that Anne Bonny's life collided with that of Calico Jack Rackham, a flamboyant pirate captain known for his love of bright clothes and bold gestures. Anne fell in with Jack's crew, eventually becoming his lover and partner. Mary Read, meanwhile, had joined a different ship entirely. Fate, or perhaps sheer chaos, brought the two women together when Jack's crew captured the ship Mary was sailing on. Mary, still disguised as a man at this point, joined Jack's crew as well. At first, Anne and Mary didn't know each other's secrets, but over time, Anne realized that the quiet young man on board was, in fact, a woman like herself. The two became close friends, perhaps even closer than friends, depending on which historians you ask. Their bond, whatever its exact nature, was one of the most remarkable elements of their shared story. Here's where the legend becomes even more fascinating. Anne and Mary didn't hide in the background or serve in secondary roles. They fought alongside the men, sword in hand, earning respect through their skill and ferocity. Contemporary accounts describe both women as capable fighters who took part in raids and battles. In some ways, piracy offered them more equality than the world on land ever could. On a pirate ship, what mattered most was courage and competence, not birth or gender. Still, it's worth noting that their situation was precarious. When docked in port, they likely maintained their disguises to avoid unwanted attention. At sea, their identities were less of a secret, but they still had to navigate the delicate politics of pirate life. Like all pirate stories, Anne and Mary's tale ended with betrayal and defeat. In late 1720, their ship was attacked by pirate hunters under the command of the British government. Calico Jack and most of the crew were reportedly drunk and unprepared for battle. Anne and Mary, however, were not. Witnesses later claimed that while the men cowered below deck, the two women fought fiercely on the upper deck, shouting at their crewmates to fight like men. It was a last, defiant stand, but ultimately, it wasn't enough. The crew was captured and brought to trial. Calico Jack and the male pirates were swiftly sentenced to hang. But Anne and Mary revealed something that bought them a temporary reprieve. Both were pregnant. This plea of the belly, as it was called, delayed their executions. Sadly, Mary fell ill in prison and died before her sentence could be carried out. Anne's fate is more mysterious. Some records suggest she was quietly released and lived out her life under a new identity. Others believe she returned to a quieter form of rebellion, her pirate days behind her. Anne Bonny and Mary Read occupy a unique space in pirate lore. They weren't the most successful pirates or the most infamous, but their very existence challenged the strict social rules of their time. Their story reminds us that piracy, for all its brutality, was also a strange kind of freedom. On land, Anne and Mary were outsiders, constrained by expectations and laws. At sea, they were warriors, equals among their crew, feared by their enemies. It's no wonder their names have endured, while so many others have been forgotten. Their lives were proof that even in an age of rigid hierarchies, some people found ways to rewrite the rules. As our recruit listens to tales of Anne and Mary, he begins to understand that piracy wasn't a single story. It was 1,000 different stories, tangled together, of desperation, rebellion, ambition, and defiance. And next, we'll turn our attention to yet another legend of the sea, a man who was neither the most flamboyant nor the most feared, but who quietly became the most successful pirate of them all. Next, we'll meet Bartholomew Roberts, better known as Black Bart, whose cunning and relentless ambition brought him more prizes than any other pirate, and ultimately to a fate as inevitable as the tide. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, the most successful and most doomed pirate captain. We sailed through the remarkable lives of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women who defied their era's strict rules to live freely, if only briefly, on the open sea. Their story was dramatic, chaotic, and deeply human. But now we turn to a very different figure. Where Anne and Mary were symbols of rebellion, Bartholomew Roberts, better known as Black Bart, was the embodiment of something more ambitious: piracy as a finely tuned machine. Roberts wasn't the loudest or the most theatrical pirate. He didn't cultivate an image like Blackbeard or swagger like Calico Jack. Instead, he was methodical, calculating, and relentless. And somehow, in a career that lasted barely 3 years, he managed to capture over 400 ships, more than any other pirate in history. Of course, this kind of success couldn't last forever. The very qualities that made Roberts so effective also made him a marked man, destined to clash with the full power of the empires he defied. Bartholomew Roberts wasn't born a pirate. In fact, he didn't even start out particularly interested in piracy at all. He was born John Roberts in Wales, sometime around 1682. Like many young men of his region, he went to sea at a relatively young age, eventually working his way up to the position of second mate on a merchant ship. Roberts was described as tall, handsome, and surprisingly well-spoken for a sailor of his station. He was also known for his sharp mind and calm temperament. There was nothing in his early life to suggest he would become the most notorious pirate of his generation. In fact, when Robert's ship was first captured by pirates, he was simply a prisoner, another unfortunate sailor forced to watch as his world turned upside down. But life at sea had taught Roberts one very important lesson: adapt or perish. And in the chaos of the early 1700s, adaptation often meant embracing the very thing you once feared. In 1719, Roberts was serving aboard a British slave ship off the coast of West Africa. One day, his vessel was attacked by a pirate ship under the command of Howell Davis, a Welsh pirate captain. Davis had a keen eye for talent, and he quickly noticed Robert's skill and intelligence. Rather than simply keeping him as a captive, Davis made Roberts an offer: join the crew and become one of them. At first, Roberts hesitated. He wasn't exactly thrilled about a life of lawlessness. But, as the story goes, he eventually saw the pragmatic side of things. As he reportedly put it, in an honest service, there's thin commons, low wages, and hard labor. In this, plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. It wasn't exactly a stirring speech about freedom or adventure. It was simply practical. Piracy offered better pay and better prospects, at least in the short term. So Roberts joined Davis's crew, though perhaps not with great enthusiasm. At this point, he was still an observer, quietly taking stock of the strange society he'd stumbled into. Robert's quiet observation didn't last long. Only a few weeks later, Howell Davis was killed in an ambush on the island of Principe. The crew, enraged and leaderless, needed a new captain. Surprisingly, they turned to Roberts, the newcomer who had only recently joined them. This choice wasn't as strange as it seems. Roberts had a natural authority and a calm, commanding presence. Even more importantly, he was intelligent and disciplined in a way many pirates were not. He could plan raids, navigate tricky political waters, and keep the crew organized. Roberts accepted the role, though perhaps reluctantly at first. And then he did something that set him apart from many other pirate captains. He gave piracy structure. While Blackbeard relied on fear and chaos, and Calico Jack leaned on charm and bravado, Roberts approached piracy like a business. Every decision was calculated, every move deliberate. He introduced strict rules aboard his ship, much like the pirate codes we discussed in Part 6. But Roberts enforced them with particular zeal. There were rules about drinking, fighting, and even when lanterns could be lit on deck at night. Punishments were harsh, but consistent, which helped keep his crew disciplined and focused. He also made strategic choices about where to attack, rather than aimlessly raiding random ships. Roberts targeted key trade routes and vulnerable ports. His favorite hunting grounds were the rich shipping lanes of the Caribbean and West Africa, where merchant ships carried everything from sugar to slaves to gold. This methodical approach paid off spectacularly. Within just a few years, Roberts captured hundreds of ships, amassing wealth and supplies on a scale few other pirates could match. Despite his discipline, Roberts was no dour taskmaster. He had a flair for presentation, though in a different way than Blackbeard. Roberts dressed elegantly, often wearing fine clothes looted from captured ships. He was particularly fond of a crimson waistcoat and feathered hat, which gave him a striking, almost regal appearance. His ship, too, was a reflection of his personality. Roberts favored sleek, fast vessels that could outmaneuver heavier naval ships. He often sailed under a distinctive black flag featuring a skeleton holding an hourglass, a symbol that reminded his enemies, and perhaps himself, that time was running out. This sense of style wasn't just vanity. It was psychological warfare. Roberts wanted to project an image of control and inevitability, making his enemies surrender without a fight whenever possible. At the peak of his career, Roberts commanded a small fleet of pirate ships and hundreds of men. He was feared across the Atlantic world, from the Caribbean islands to the coasts of Africa. One of his most audacious moves came when he attacked treasure ships bound for Europe, loaded with goods and wealth. On more than one occasion, entire convoys fled at the mere sight of Robert's sails on the horizon. His reputation became so fearsome that colonial governments were forced to take him seriously. The British, in particular, began to see Roberts not as a mere nuisance, but as a genuine threat to their maritime empire. And that, of course, meant his days were numbered. In February of 1722, Roberts was near Cape Lopez, off the coast of modern-day Gabon, when he encountered a heavily armed British warship, HMS Swallow. The battle that followed was fierce but brief. Roberts fought bravely, even as his men panicked. But a single musket ball struck him in the throat, killing him instantly. In that moment, the most successful pirate of the age was gone. His crew, leaderless and demoralized, quickly surrendered. The British wasted no time in making an example of them. Scores of Roberts' men were tried and executed, their bodies displayed as a warning to others. Roberts himself was buried at sea, dressed in his finest clothes, a fitting, if somber, farewell for a man who had lived by style and strategy. Bartholomew Roberts' story is unusual in the world of piracy. He wasn't a natural-born outlaw or a wild-eyed adventurer. He was, in many ways, a reluctant pirate who simply saw an opportunity and took it. But once he committed, he pursued piracy with unmatched focus and discipline. His brief career reshaped the image of what a pirate could be, not just a raider, but a commander, strategist, and symbol of defiance. And yet, for all his brilliance, Robert's end was inevitable. No pirate could stand forever against the combined might of the world's empires. The same efficiency that made him so dangerous also made him a top priority for destruction. With Robert's death, piracy entered a new phase. The golden age of wild, unrestrained raiding was beginning to crumble. Governments were finally taking coordinated action to stamp out the threat once and for all. Next, we'll explore how the world's great powers, Britain, Spain, France, and others, turned their full attention to eradicating piracy. It was a campaign of warships, laws, and brutal public spectacles designed to send a single, chilling message. The governments strike back, empires begin the great pirate crackdowns. Previously, we watched the meteoric rise and sudden fall of Bartholomew Roberts, or Black Bart, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age. His death wasn't just the end of one man's story. It was a turning point. For decades, piracy had thrived in the cracks between empires, a symptom of chaos on the seas. Governments were too distracted, too divided, and sometimes too corrupt to deal with it properly. But Robert's audacity and the staggering number of ships he captured finally forced the great powers to admit what they'd been avoiding. Piracy had grown from a nuisance into a direct threat to global trade and imperial prestige. And naturally, once the empires decided to act, they did so with overwhelming force and a flair for theatrical cruelty. Tonight, we drift into this final chapter of widespread piracy, a chapter defined by warships, new laws, and very public warnings. The storm that had been gathering for years was about to break, and the pirates were standing directly in its path. From tolerance to intolerance. To understand how dramatic this shift was, we need to rewind just a bit. For much of the late 1600s and early 1700s, piracy had been a gray area. Some pirates weren't really pirates at all. They were privateers, men given official licenses called letters of marque to attack enemy ships during wartime. As long as they handed a cut of the profits to their sponsoring government, they were considered respectable enough, or at least useful. But wars ended, treaties were signed, and many of these privateers were suddenly out of work. To them, piracy wasn't a shocking career change. It was simply continuing the same activities, just without the paperwork. Governments, meanwhile, often looked the other way. Colonial governors sometimes secretly traded with pirates or even took bribes to let them operate freely. After all, pirates brought in valuable goods that were otherwise difficult to obtain. This quiet, unofficial tolerance is what allowed piracy to flourish for so long. But by the 1720s, things had changed. The great European empires, Britain, Spain, France, and the Dutch Republic, were expanding rapidly. They were building vast colonial networks fueled by trade in sugar, tobacco, slaves, and silver. Pirates weren't just stealing from individual merchants anymore. They were interfering with the very foundation of imperial wealth. At that point, piracy became more than an inconvenience. It became unacceptable. The Roberts problem. Bartholomew Roberts' incredible success forced the issue. As we discussed in the last part, Roberts captured more than 400 ships in just a few years. He terrorized both the Caribbean and West African coasts, often outsmarting the very warships sent to stop him. When Roberts was finally killed in 1722, the British celebrated it as a major victory and a wake-up call. The message was clear: if pirates could grow that powerful, the empires needed to treat them as a serious enemy, not just petty criminals. And so Britain and its rivals launched a full-scale crackdown, both at sea and on land. The rise of the pirate hunters. The first step was to send better ships and better men to hunt pirates directly. In the past, many naval patrols had been half-hearted affairs. Crews were underpaid, the ships were slow, and the officers often lacked motivation. Now, however, the empires were willing to invest. They dispatched fast, heavily armed warships specifically designed to outmatch pirate vessels. These ships were crewed by experienced sailors and commanded by ambitious officers eager to make a name for themselves. Pirate hunters also began using clever tactics. For example, the British sometimes disguised their warships to look like merchant vessels, luring pirates into an ambush. It was a cruel trick, but a highly effective one. One of the most famous pirate hunters was Captain Jonathan Barnett, who captured Calico Jack Rackham along with Anne Bonny and Mary Read, as we explored back in Part 14. Barnett's victory wasn't just a tactical win. It was a symbolic blow against the pirates' strongholds in the Caribbean. Laws designed to terrify. Of course, catching pirates at sea was only half the battle. The other half was legal and psychological. Governments needed to make piracy look so dangerous, so hopeless, that no sane sailor would ever consider it. To do this, they introduced a series of new anti-piracy laws. One of the most important was Britain's Piracy Act of 1698, which laid the groundwork for faster, more brutal trials. By the early 1700s, piracy trials could be held locally in colonial ports like Jamaica or Charleston. This meant captured pirates could be tried and executed quickly without waiting months for transport back to England. And the executions themselves were deliberately public and horrifying. Gallows were often built near busy harbors so that every sailor and merchant could witness the fate of those who defied the crown. Bodies were sometimes displayed in chains, left to rot as a warning. One infamous example is the execution of Charles Vane's crew, where their remains were placed along the shoreline as a grim deterrent. The message was clear. This is what happens to pirates. The end of safe havens. For years, pirates had relied on a network of safe havens, friendly ports, where they could repair ships, sell stolen goods, and spend their ill-gotten wealth. Nassau in the Bahamas was perhaps the most famous of these, as we discussed earlier with Calico Jack and Anne Bonny. But now, colonial governors were under intense pressure to shut these places down. Some, like Governor Woodes Rogers of the Bahamas, were former privateers themselves. Rogers understood pirates intimately, and he knew how to dismantle their networks piece by piece. He offered royal pardons to pirates who surrendered peacefully, a tactic designed to reduce the number of active outlaws. At the same time, he cracked down ruthlessly on those who refused. It was a carrot and stick approach: mercy for the smart ones, death for the stubborn ones. As safe havens vanished, life became harder for the remaining pirates. Without reliable places to resupply, their ships grew weaker, their crews hungrier, and their influence faded. The noose tightens, the combination of relentless naval patrols, harsh new laws, and disappearing hideouts slowly strangled piracy. By the mid-1720s, pirate captains like Roberts were no longer seen as daring rebels. They were hunted men constantly on the run. Every raid carried enormous risk, and every port visit was a gamble. Some pirates tried to negotiate surrender, taking advantage of pardons while they were still available. Others fought to the bitter end, clinging to their freedom, even as the world closed in around them. For ordinary sailors, the choice became increasingly clear: stay on the straight and narrow, or face near certain death as a pirate. The Golden Age was drawing to a close, not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow, grinding inevitability, foreshadowing the final reckoning. As the government struck harder and harder, the public trials and hangings we'll explore became a form of theater. Executions weren't just punishments, they were performances carefully staged to terrify and control. Next time, we'll step into the grim world of those trials, from the crowded courtrooms where pirates heard their fates, to the towering gallows where their stories ended. It is a somber chapter, but a necessary one, because it shows us just how determined the empires were to erase piracy from history, one neck at a time. Trials and hangings, the gruesome legal system designed to destroy piracy. We saw how the great empires finally decided they'd had enough of pirates. Gone were the days of tolerance and secret bribes, when governors and merchants quietly benefited from a little well-placed chaos. Now piracy was treated not merely as a nuisance, but as a direct challenge to imperial order, and it was met with overwhelming force. But warships alone weren't enough to end piracy. Catching pirates at sea was only the first step. To truly kill the idea of piracy, the empires needed something more public, more visible, and far more terrifying. So they turned to the law, though law in this case was less about fairness and more about creating a carefully staged performance of power. What followed were grim trials and spectacular executions, designed not just to punish pirates, but to erase them, body and soul, from the world's oceans. Tonight, we drift into that dark and strangely theatrical world: the courtrooms, the judges, the final speeches, and the creaking gallows where the golden age of piracy finally came to an end. The need for speed, colonial justice at sea. Back in the earlier days of piracy, trials were slow and cumbersome. Captured pirates had to be shipped back across the Atlantic to England, which took weeks or months. By the time a verdict was reached, the case was already old news, and sometimes the prisoners died of disease along the way, robbing the authorities of their big public spectacle. As piracy spiraled out of control, the British government realized they needed to streamline the process. So they passed new laws allowing piracy trials to be held locally, right there in the colonies. The Piracy Act of 1698 and later amendments gave colonial governors the power to set up special courts called vice admiralty courts. These weren't like normal civilian courts. There were no juries of sympathetic peers. Instead, the judges were naval officers or crown-appointed officials, men with no personal ties to the accused, and every incentive to deliver guilty verdicts quickly. The rules were simple and brutal. A pirate could be tried on the testimony of just 2 witnesses, and in many cases, a single written statement was enough. Evidence was often thin, sometimes hearsay, but that didn't really matter. The goal wasn't to ensure justice. The goal was to make examples. And of course, the results were almost always the same. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The courtroom atmosphere. Trials were public events, and everyone knew their role in this strange drama. The accused pirates were often brought and chained together, filthy and exhausted from weeks in the hold of a ship or a colonial prison. Imagine the scene, a sweltering room filled with curious townsfolk, merchants, and perhaps a few nervous sailors who'd once thought about turning pirate themselves. At the front, stern-faced judges sat in their wigs and robes, representing the full majesty of imperial law. And in the dock, ragged men, sunburned, scarred, sometimes missing limbs, who had spent their lives on the margins of society. The charges were read aloud in slow, deliberate tones. Often, the list of crimes stretched on for several minutes. Attacking, plundering, burning, and sinking ships belonging to His Majesty's subjects and allies. It was a ritual humiliation, each phrase a reminder of the might they had dared to defy. Some pirates tried to defend themselves, delivering rambling speeches about poverty, injustice, or betrayal by corrupt governors. Others stood silent, knowing there was no point. A few even laughed bitterly, embracing the role of villain in this grim theater. But in nearly every case, the outcome was predetermined. The court would retire for a short time, sometimes only an hour, and return with the expected verdict: death by hanging. The spectacle of execution. If the trial was a performance, the execution was the grand finale. Governments understood the power of spectacle. A single execution in a private courtyard might remove one pirate, but it wouldn't deter the others. What they needed was something unforgettable, something that would stick in the minds of every sailor, merchant, and would-be rebel. So pirate executions were held in public places, often near busy harbors. The idea was to make sure as many people as possible could watch the consequences of piracy play out in real time. On execution day, crowds would gather long before dawn. Merchants shut down their shops. Children were brought by their parents to witness this grim lesson, and sailors packed every available space near the gallows. The condemned were led through the streets in a slow procession, sometimes with a minister walking beside them, urging them to repent. The pirates often sang sea shanties, cursed their captors, or remained eerily quiet, each man facing death in his own way. When they reached the gallows, The atmosphere grew almost festive, like a bizarre holiday. Vendors sold food and drink to the spectators. People laughed and gossiped, and all the while, the condemned waited, chains clinking, for the moment when the trapdoor would fall. One of the most chilling traditions was gibbeting, placing the executed pirate's body in a metal cage and displaying it in a prominent location, often near a harbor or river mouth. The corpse would hang there for weeks, slowly decaying, as a warning to anyone thinking of following in their footsteps. The most famous example is probably William Kidd, better known as Captain Kidd. After his execution in 1701, his body was hung in chains along the Thames River in London, where it remained until it was nothing more than bones swaying in the wind. In the Caribbean, these grisly displays were especially common. Colonial authorities wanted every ship entering port to be greeted by the unmistakable sight of a pirate's remains, like a silent proclamation. This is what happens to those who challenge the empire. It was effective in a deeply unsettling way. Fear became a tool as powerful as any cannon or warship. Famous final words. Some pirates went to their deaths quietly, but others left behind memorable last words, ensuring they'd live on in legend even as their bodies swung from the rope. Take Calico Jack Rackham, captured with Anne Bonny and Mary Read, as we explored in Part 14. As he stood on the gallows in Jamaica in 1720, he reportedly showed little remorse. Anne Bonny, visiting him before the execution, supposedly delivered the cutting line, "If you'd fought like a man, you needn't be hanged like a dog." Then there was Bartholomew Roberts, whose death marked the beginning of the end for large-scale piracy, as we discussed. Though he didn't live to face trial, many of his captured crew did. Some went stoically, others defiantly, refusing to beg for mercy. Their courage only added to the legend of the pirate's life and death. The psychological war. These trials and hangings weren't just about killing pirates. They were about killing piracy itself, not only the men, but the very idea that a sailor could escape his lot by hoisting the black flag, by making the executions so public, so dramatic. The empires sent a clear message. The sea no longer belonged to freebooters and rebels. It belonged to kings, parliaments, and mighty corporations like the East India Company. This psychological campaign worked. As the gallows filled and the gibbets swayed in the wind, fewer sailors were willing to take the risk. Pirate crews dwindled, ships deserted, and one by one, the surviving captains were hunted down, foreshadowing the end. But the story doesn't quite end here. Even as public hangings terrified the masses, a few pirate ships remained at large, defiant symbols of a dying era. They sailed under the black flag for a few more desperate years, clinging to the old ways as the world closed in around them. Next, we'll follow those last ships on their final voyages. It's a quieter chapter, tinged with melancholy, as the age of piracy fades not with a dramatic explosion, but with a slow, inevitable sigh. The last pirate ships, the final voyages before piracy faded into legend. We drifted through the grim world of pirate trials and executions, where gallows creaked in the wind and imperial justice staged elaborate performances to scare sailors back into obedience. It was a world of spectacle, gibbets swaying by the harbors, pirates publicly humiliated before being sent to their deaths. Those trials worked. Slowly, steadily, piracy unraveled. But the end of piracy didn't happen in one dramatic, final battle. There was no single moment where the black flags were lowered forever and the world's oceans became perfectly safe. Instead, piracy faded away. An old candle burns out, flickering for a while, sputtering in the dark, before finally going cold. Tonight, we'll drift alongside those last pirate ships, the ones that kept sailing even as the world turned against them. The last desperate captains, the dwindling crews, and the quiet, melancholy end of an era, the collapse of a network. To understand why piracy faded, we need to remember how it thrived in the first place. Back in part 3, we explored how wars, colonies, and chaos created the perfect storm for piracy. Empires were too distracted fighting each other to police every harbor and every ship. Corrupt governors turned a blind eye, merchants paid bribes, and there were always places where pirates could find safe harbor. But by the 1720s, that entire network began to collapse. The empires had finished fighting each other, for now, and started turning their attention inward. Navies grew larger, faster, and better coordinated. Colonial governors were replaced with stricter, more loyal men who weren't willing to look the other way. Suddenly, pirates found themselves with nowhere to hide. Ports that had once welcomed them now slammed their gates shut. Taverns where they'd once spent their stolen gold were raided by soldiers. And when they tried to sell captured goods, they found buyers too frightened to deal with them. Pirates were used to living on the margins. But now, even the margins were shrinking. The final holdouts. Some pirate captains saw the writing on the wall and gave up while they still could. The British government offered amnesty programs, promising that pirates who surrendered would be pardoned, provided they gave up piracy completely. Many took the deal. After years of constant danger, even the most rebellious sailors were ready for a little peace and dry land. But not everyone surrendered. A few captains refused to bow to the empire. They saw surrender as worse than death, and so they kept sailing, even when the odds were hopeless. One of the most famous of these last holdouts was Edward Lowe, better known as Ned Lowe. If Blackbeard was a fearsome figure, Lowe was something else entirely. He was brutal, unpredictable, and deeply feared, not just by merchants, but by his own crew. Stories about him describe acts so horrific that even hardened pirates were disgusted. By the late 1720s, Lowe's fleet had dwindled to a handful of ships. He no longer had safe harbors or friendly merchants willing to trade. Every voyage was a gamble, every raid a desperate attempt to gather supplies before the Royal Navy caught up. Eventually, his crew mutinied. Lowe vanished into history, his final fate uncertain, though some say he was marooned and left to die on a deserted island. An appropriately lonely end for one of the last truly terrifying pirate captains. The Royal Navy's iron grip. The decline of piracy wasn't just about individual captains being hunted down. It was about overwhelming naval power closing in on all sides. The Royal Navy, once scattered and underfunded, had transformed into a massive global force. Before, we saw how entire squadrons were dedicated to anti-pirate patrols. By the 1730s, these patrols were so efficient that even the fastest pirate sloops struggled to escape. Naval strategy was straightforward but devastatingly effective. The Navy targeted pirate strongholds first, places like Nassau in the Bahamas, which had been pirate havens for years. By capturing these bases, they cut off pirates from supplies, rest, and recruitment. Then, they focused on tracking individual ships. Fast, maneuverable warships like the sixth-rate frigates were built specifically to chase pirates down. And when a pirate ship was finally cornered, there was little hope of escape. Royal Navy gunners were well trained, their cannons heavy and precise. Pirate ships, by contrast, were often patched together with whatever wood they could scavenge and manned by exhausted crews. The result was rarely a battle. It was more like a slaughter, quiet deaths at sea. As pirate numbers dwindled, their final moments often went unnoticed. There were no grand sea battles, like the movies depict, no last stands with dramatic speeches. Most final encounters were quick, chaotic, and strangely silent. Picture a small pirate sloop, sails tattered, crew starving, trying to slip through the fog at dawn. On the horizon, a British frigate appears faster, cleaner, its cannons already loaded. The pirate crew knows they can't win. Some throw their weapons overboard, hoping for mercy. Others fight anyway, more out of pride than strategy. And then it's over. A few blasts of cannon fire, a final shout, a plume of smoke. The pirate ship sinks beneath the waves, its name forgotten, its story lost. Many pirate crews vanished like this, their ends barely recorded. The emotional toll. For the last pirates, the decline wasn't just about physical danger. It was about watching their world disappear around them. When piracy had been at its height, back in part 7, when we explored the chaotic daily life aboard pirate ships, there had been a strange sense of freedom. Harsh, dangerous freedom, yes, but freedom nonetheless. Now that freedom was gone. Every tavern was suspicious, every merchant hostile, every harbor patrolled by the Navy. The dream of living outside the Empire's rules had died, leaving only fear and hunger. Even those who surrendered under the amnesty programs found life ashore to be bitterly disappointing. Many were forced into low-paying labor, constantly watched by authorities who never fully trusted them. For those who'd once lived by their own pirate code, a rough, rebellious democracy as we saw, this new life felt like chains all over again. The very last black flags. By the mid-1730s, piracy as a global phenomenon was essentially over. There were still scattered acts of theft and violence at sea. Of course, there always are. But the era of organized pirate fleets, legendary captains, and bold raids on entire towns had passed. The last major figure often associated with the Golden Age was William Fly, captured in 1726. Fly was young, reckless, and entirely unprepared for the new world he lived in. His execution was treated as a symbolic event, a final nail in the coffin of the old pirate dream. Fly reportedly used his last words to criticize the harsh treatment of sailors by their captains, a reminder that the same cruel conditions we discussed back in part 2 were still driving men to desperation. His death didn't fix those problems, of course, but it marked the end of an era when rebellion at sea had seemed possible. The ocean falls silent. By the late 1730s, the black flags were gone. The oceans, once alive with chaos and rebellion, now moved to the steady rhythm of imperial trade. Warships patrolled the major routes, merchant convoys sailed in tight formation, and the great colonial empires grew ever richer. For the men who had once been pirates, their stories faded into whispers. Some became legends, exaggerated and romanticized over time. Others were simply forgotten, their names sinking into the depths like the wrecks of their ships. The world had moved on, looking ahead. But even though piracy was gone from the oceans, it wasn't gone from the human imagination. The next chapter of our story will explore how pirates, once feared and despised, became mythic heroes in books, plays, and eventually movies. Next, we'll drift into that strange transformation, how history became legend, and how those long dead, ragged men turned into the swashbuckling figures we picture today whenever we think of pirates. Good night, pirates, a final, reflective farewell to the age of piracy. And here we are, the end of our long, winding voyage through stormy seas, broken masts, and centuries of myth-making. We've drifted together from the first uneasy trade routes of Part 1 to the cramped and stinking pirate ships of Part 7, through the rise and fall of Blackbeard and Bonnie and countless nameless sailors whose lives were swallowed by the sea. Now, at last, we sail into calmer waters, not because the story is over, but because the world has moved on. Tonight, we aren't here to glorify or condemn, just to remember, to reflect on an age that, while long gone, still whispers through our books, our movies, and our imagination. So settle in one last time. The seas are quiet now, the cannons have fallen silent, and the black flags, once a symbol of terror, are nothing more than faded relics in museum glass. The real pirates we met along the way. It's easy, especially after Part 19, to lose sight of the fact that real pirates once lived, breathed, and cursed their bad luck beneath the same sun and stars we see today. Behind every legend, there was a human story. Blackbeard, who in life was simply Edward Teach, wasn't the supernatural monster that later tales made him out to be. As we explored back in Part 13, he was a skilled sailor and a clever tactician. The smoldering fuses in his beard, maybe a real trick, maybe just a rumor, weren't about evil magic. They were about psychological warfare, a way to make enemies think twice before raising their guns. In the end, he died not with treasure in his hands, but bleeding out on the deck of a small ship, surrounded by men who wanted his head as proof of victory. Then there were Anne Bonny and Mary Read, whose story we followed in Part 14. Two women who defied every expectation of their time. For a brief, strange moment, they found freedom at sea, though it came at a terrible cost. Their tale isn't one of buried treasure or happy endings. It's a story of survival, anger, and rebellion against a world that gave them very few choices. And Bartholomew Roberts, the gentleman pirate we met in part 15, who rose to lead one of the most successful pirate fleets in history, only to be struck down by a single bullet, his body quietly buried at sea. No dramatic speeches, no epic battle, just another man gone, swallowed by the ocean he once ruled. They were complicated people, dangerous, yes, but also vulnerable, scared, ambitious, and sometimes heartbreakingly young. The myths rarely capture that part. The ocean that remembers the sea has always been a strange place in human imagination. It's vast, mysterious, and unbothered by our brief little histories. Empires rise and fall. Governments stamp out piracy. Movies rewrite the past. But the ocean? It just keeps moving, wave after wave, as if none of it ever mattered. Sometimes I wonder if the sea remembers those old ships, the creaking timbers, the shouts of battle, the groaning of sails under heavy winds. If you stood on the deck of a modern cargo ship in the middle of the night, you might almost hear it, the echoes of a world long gone. We explored the anatomy of a pirate ship, from its sails to its filthy, rat-infested decks. Those ships are all gone now, rotted away or sunk beneath the waves. But perhaps, deep on the ocean floor, some fragment remains, a cannonball, a piece of wood, a single coin that once passed from hand to hand, silent, but not entirely forgotten. The legacy we chose, as we discussed in part 19, the legacy of piracy didn't end with the last pirate's hanging. Instead, it transformed into stories, songs, and eventually films. We chose to remember pirates not as they truly were, but as we wish they had been: bold, romantic, and a little bit ridiculous. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. After all, humans have always reshaped history into myths. We need our heroes and villains, even if they're made of equal parts truth and fiction. The pirate you picture today, with the jaunty hat, the treasure map, and the questionable hygiene, is less a historical figure and more a symbol of rebellion, of freedom in its roughest form, of saying no to the rules, even if only for a little while. Still, I hope we also remember the real men and women beneath those myths, a hungry sailor forced to turn pirate because his wages were stolen, the captive who voted on a new captain, exercising one of the only forms of democracy available to him, the woman disguised as a man, fighting her way through a world that gave her no other options. Their lives were not fairy tales, but they were, in their own way, extraordinary, closing the book. And so, our journey comes to an end. We've spent 20 long parts together, moving from calm beginnings to storm-tossed chaos, through rise, fall, and legend. It's been a slow drift through time, like a ship carried by the tide. Piracy, like all things, had its season. It flared brightly for a few decades, burned itself out, and left behind stories that would outlive the pirates themselves. Empires learned to police their waters more effectively. Trade routes grew secure. The world moved on, as it always does. But the image of a tattered black flag still lingers. It flies now in our minds rather than over a mast. A reminder that somewhere in our collective memory, there's a longing for wildness, for a life beyond the boundaries of laws and kings. Good night, pirates. As we close this final chapter, let's leave the pirates where they belong, not marching across movie screens or theme park rides, but back on the quiet, endless sea. Let them fade into the mist, their sails disappearing over the horizon. Imagine, just for a moment, the sound of the waves rocking gently against a wooden hull, the creak of ropes, the soft flap of a sail, the distant call of a seabird, and then silence. The age of piracy is over, but its stories will keep drifting like messages in bottles carried by the currents of time. So, good night, Blackbeard. Good night, Anne Bonny and Mary Red. Good night to every nameless sailor who dreamed of freedom beneath a starry sky. Good night, pirates, wherever you are now. And good night to you, dear listener. Thank you for sailing with me through these 20 parts. May your dreams tonight be calm, your seas smooth, and your horizon endless.